The gas station sat at the edge of a lonely stretch of highway, its flickering neon sign barely cutting through the gathering dusk. Jack Turner pulled his battered pickup into the lot, the rhythmic clunk of the engine a soothing familiarity. His hands tightened briefly on the wheel as he glanced at the rearview mirror, a habit born from years of vigilance. He parked near the pump, stepped out, and stretched, his boots scuffing against the cracked asphalt. Jack was a man who blended into the background. A worn ball cap, flannel shirt, and a quiet demeanor. The only detail that stood out was the small metal pin to his chest, a bronze star, dulled by time but meticulously polished around its edges. For Jack, it wasn't a symbol of glory, but of memories he couldn't forget. As he inserted the nozzle and started filling his tank, the rumble of motorcycle engines shattered the stillness. Four bikes roared into the station, their riders laughing and shouting as they parked haphazardly around the lot. Their leader, a tall man with a leather vest emblazoned with a skull insignia, dismounted and immediately scanned the area. His name, as Jack would soon learn, was Rex. "Look at this dump," Rex muttered loud enough for everyone to hear, smirking at his companions. "And look who we have here." His gaze landed on Jack. Jack pretended not to notice, focusing on the numbers ticking up on the pump. Years of military discipline taught him to assess threats without provoking them. But the bikers weren't ones to let a quiet man be. "Hey, old-timer," Rex called out, sauntering closer. "What's with the shiny trinket on your chest? Playing soldier, are we?" Jack's jaw tightened, but he didn't respond. He replaced the nozzle and turned toward the cashier station, his boots steady despite the mounting tension. "Too good to talk to us, huh?" Rex sneered. His buddies chuckled, closing in around Jack. A young cashier, barely out of her teens, peeked nervously from behind the glass window of the station. She looked from Jack to the bikers, her hand hovering near the phone. "Leave him alone," she murmured, her voice too soft to reach them. Jack stopped just short of the door. He turned slowly, meeting Rex's gaze for the first time. "I'm not looking for trouble," he said evenly, his deep voice carrying a quiet strength. "Just passing through." Rex smirked, stepping closer. "Well, trouble's looking for you. That little medal. What's it for, huh? Did you win it playing chess or something?" One of the bikers laughed. "Bet it's from the Salvation Army." Jack's eyes darkened, but his expression remained calm. "It's none of your business," he said. That was the wrong answer. Rex reached out and flicked the medal with his finger. The sharp metallic clink echoed in the air. "Oh, I think it is," Rex said, his grin widening. Inside the station, the cashier fumbled with her phone, her hands trembling. She hesitated, unsure whether to call for help or hope the situation would diffuse. Jack took a slow breath, his fingers curling into fists at his sides. The memory of another time, another confrontation, surfaced in his mind. Soldiers surrounded, a friend down, the weight of impossible decisions pressing on his chest. The sound of Rex's mocking laughter brought him back to the present. "Come on, old man. Tell us a war story. Or are you just another washed-up vet pretending to be somebody?" Jack's voice was quiet but firm. "You don't want to do this." Rex leaned in, his face inches from Jack's. "Oh, but I do." The air grew heavy as the other bikers circled closer. The cashier's voice was barely audible over the roaring tension. "Please, someone do something." In that moment, Jack made a choice. He wasn't just a man at a gas station anymore. He was a veteran who'd faced worse odds than this. And he wasn't about to let a group of bullies take away his dignity. "I've run from enough fights," he thought, straightening his posture. But even as he braced himself for what was to come, he couldn't shake the question echoing in his mind. How far am I willing to go to defend what I stand for? The first punch hadn't been thrown yet, but the battle had already begun. The first punch wasn't from Rex or any of his crew. It came from Jack's memory. As he squared his shoulders, preparing for the biker's inevitable escalation, the edges of the gas station faded, and he was back in the desert. The blazing sun burned his skin, and the stench of sand, sweat, and diesel fuel filled his nose. It was his third tour, and his unit was pinned down under enemy fire. Jack remembered the shouting, the chaos, and the heavy weight of a wounded comrade slumped against him. That day, They'd survived by the skin of their teeth, but not everyone made it back. Jack blinked, snapping back to the present as Rex's mocking voice cut through the haze. "Cat got your tongue, old man?" Rex sneered, the smirk never leaving his face. Jack's past wasn't something he wore proudly. The metal pinned to his chest wasn't a boast. It was a reminder of a friend who hadn't made it home. Sergeant Kyle Harper. They'd been inseparable since boot camp. Kyle had been the funny one, the glue that kept the team together, always cracking jokes even in the direst situations. Until that last mission, when Kyle had shielded Jack from a sniper's bullet. "You don't want to do this," Jack repeated, his voice steady despite the storm of memories swirling inside him. But Rex wasn't listening. "Looks like we hit a nerve, boys," one of the bikers chuckled, pulling a cigarette from his vest pocket. Jack's mind drifted again, this time to the days after his discharge. The silence of civilian life had been deafening. His wife, Laura, had tried to understand, but the walls Jack built around himself were too high for even her to climb. Eventually, the distance grew too great, and one day, Laura left, leaving only a note. "I can't compete with ghosts." "Hey!" Rex's sharp voice pulled Jack back to the present again. Rex reached out, grabbing the metal and tugging it sharply. "What's so special about this little trinket, huh? Tell us." The sensation of the metal being yanked from his chest was like a slap. Jack instinctively grabbed Rex's wrist, his grip firm but not violent. "Let it go," Jack said, his voice low and cold. The laughter from Rex's crew died down, tension crackling in the air like static. "You got a problem with me?" Rex asked, yanking his hand back but keeping the smug grin plastered across his face. "Because if you do, you better speak up now, Grandpa." Jack didn't respond. He didn't need to. His eyes, sharp and unflinching, said everything. Inside the station, the young cashier, Samantha, watched nervously. She'd seen Rex and his gang before. They were regulars at the local bar, always causing trouble but never facing consequences. The town's police had long ago learned to look the other way when the gang was involved. But Samantha saw something different in Jack. He wasn't just another victim. There was a quiet strength about him, a sense of purpose in the way he stood his ground. It was enough to make her dial 911, even though she knew the cops might not come. Jack exhaled slowly. "Stay calm," he told himself. "Don't give them an excuse." But the memories kept coming. Kyle's laugh, the weight of his wife's absence, the countless nights sitting alone in the dark, wondering if he'd ever feel whole again. And now this, a pack of bikers who didn't know a thing about the sacrifices he'd made, mocking him like he was nothing. "Still not talking?" Rex pressed, taking a step closer. "Fine. Maybe this'll get you to open up." In one swift motion, Rex swatted the metal off Jack's chest. It clattered to the ground, the sound ringing louder than any insult. Jack's eyes followed it as it settled on the asphalt. For a moment, the world went still. "You shouldn't have done that," Jack said softly, his voice steady as a steel blade. "Oh yeah?" Rex taunted, spreading his arms wide. "And what are you gonna do about it, huh? Show me some of those war moves?" Jack bent down slowly, retrieving the metal. He brushed it off carefully, his hands steady despite the storm brewing inside him. Samantha's voice suddenly cut through the tension. "Leave him alone." The bikers turned toward the sound, their expressions a mix of amusement and annoyance. "Well, look at that," one of them said with a grin. "The kid's got some guts." "Stay out of this, sweetheart," Rex warned, his tone dripping with condescension. "This is between me and Grandpa here." But Samantha didn't back down. Her hands were shaking, but her voice didn't falter. "Why don't you pick on someone who deserves it instead of harassing a veteran?" The bikers laughed, but Jack didn't. He straightened, slipping the metal back onto his chest. For the first time, a flicker of something passed through his eyes, a mix of gratitude and determination. "You've made your point," Jack said, stepping between Samantha and the bikers. "Now walk away." Rex's grin faded. "Or what?" Jack didn't answer. Instead, he stood his ground, the weight of his past and present converging in this single moment. He wasn't just fighting for himself anymore. He was fighting for every part of his life he'd ever lost. and for the courage he saw in the young cashier who refused to look away. The next move would decide everything. The silence stretched, heavy and electric, as Rex and Jack stared each other down. For a moment, it seemed like Rex might back off, but the mocking sneer returned to his face. He didn't take well to being challenged, especially not by someone he saw as weak. "Boys," Rex called over his shoulder, his voice laced with false camaraderie. "Looks like we got ourselves a hero. What do you say we teach him a lesson?" Jack remained calm, his stance steady. Years of training had taught him not to flinch in the face of aggression, even when outnumbered. One of the bikers, a wiry man with a snake tattoo coiling around his neck, stepped forward. "Careful, old man," he jeered. "You might throw out your back trying to play tough." Jack ignored him, his focus locked on Rex. "You've got your fun," he said evenly. "Now leave before this gets out of hand." Rex chuckled darkly, taking another step forward. "Out of hand? You've got no idea who you're messing with." Then it happened. Rex lunged, shoving Jack hard in the chest. Jack stumbled back a step, but didn't fall. His reflexes, honed from years of combat, kicked in. He caught himself, planting his feet firmly on the cracked asphalt. The cashier, Samantha, gasped from behind the glass. Her fingers tightened around the phone as she pleaded silently for the police to answer. Jack raised his hands, palms outward. "I'm not here to fight," he said. Rex's grin widened. "Good. That makes it easier for me." The punch came fast, aimed directly at Jack's face. But Jack was faster. He sidestepped the swing, grabbing Rex's wrist and twisting it just enough to force him off balance. Rex stumbled but quickly recovered, his face twisting in anger. "Oh, you've done it now," Rex growled. The other bikers surged forward. Jack's mind went into overdrive, his body moving instinctively. He dodged a wild swing from the wiry biker with the snake tattoo, using the man's momentum to shove him into another gang member. The two collided and fell in a heap, cursing loudly. Rex rushed to Jack again, this time with both fists swinging. Jack ducked under the blows, stepping to the side and planting a firm kick to the back of Rex's knee. Rex dropped with a grunt, glaring up at Jack from the ground. "Stay down," Jack warned, his voice as sharp as a command from the field. But the bikers weren't done. The largest of the group, a brute of a man with a shaved head, charged at Jack like a bull. Jack braced himself, stepping into the man's path and using his own weight to redirect the charge. The biker stumbled past him, slamming into the side of the gas pump with a metallic clang. Inside the station, Samantha's voice finally broke through. "I've called the cops," she shouted. "They're on their way." Rex got to his feet, his face red with fury. "You're dead, old man," he spat, pulling a knife from his belt. The blade gleamed in the fluorescent light, deadly and menacing. Jack's heart raced, but his face remained calm. He had faced worse than this. He shifted his stance slightly, preparing for whatever came next. "Put it down," Jack said, his voice cold and commanding. Rex hesitated for a fraction of a second. Then he lunged. Jack moved swiftly, deflecting the knife with his forearm and twisting Rex's wrist with precision. The blade clattered to the ground. Jack followed through with a strike to Rex's chest, knocking the wind out of him. Rex crumpled to the ground, gasping for air. His crew froze, the fight knocked out of them by the sight of their leader's defeat. "Enough," Jack barked, his voice echoing across the lot. He looked at each of the bikers in turn, his gaze hard and unyielding. "Take him and go. Now." The bikers hesitated, glancing at each other, before reluctantly moving to help Rex to his feet. He glared at Jack, his eyes promising vengeance, but he said nothing. The sound of sirens pierced the night, growing louder as the police approached. "This isn't over," Rex muttered, his voice low and venomous. Jack watched them leave, his body still tense, ready for more. Only when the roar of their motorcycles faded into the distance did he allow himself to relax. Samantha burst out of the station, her face pale but determined. "Are you okay?" she asked, her voice trembling. Jack nodded, brushing dust off his flannel shirt. "I'm fine," he said. "Thanks for calling them." The flashing lights of the police cars illuminated the lot as they pulled in. Jack sighed. knowing he'd have to explain what happened. But as he looked at Samantha's grateful expression and thought about the gang's retreat, he felt something he hadn't felt in years: purpose. This fight isn't over, he thought. And it's not just about me. The flashing blue and red lights painted the gas station in shifting hues, adding an eerie edge to the aftermath of the fight. Jack stood near the pumps, arms crossed, while Samantha hovered close by, her hands clasped tightly in front of her. The police cruiser doors opened, and two officers stepped out, one older with a graying mustache, the other younger, barely out of the academy. "Evening," said the older officer, his sharp eyes scanning the scene. "We got a call about a disturbance." "That was me," Samantha said quickly, stepping forward. "There was a fight. Those bikers," she gestured toward the empty stretch of highway where Rex and his gang had fled. "They were harassing him." She pointed to Jack. The younger officer glanced at Jack, his brow furrowing. "You okay, sir?" Jack nodded. "I'm fine." The older officer approached Jack, his gaze narrowing. "Mind telling us what happened?" Jack sighed. "A group of bikers showed up, started causing trouble. One of them got aggressive, and I defended myself." "That all?" the officer pressed, his tone skeptical. Samantha chimed in. "He didn't start it. They were mocking him, pushed him, even pulled a knife on him." The older officer's expression didn't soften. He looked Jack up and down, taking in his weathered face, the metal still pinned to his chest, and the tension in his stance. "You military?" "Was," Jack said shortly. "That explains a lot," the officer muttered. "Look, we've dealt with Rex and his crew before. They're trouble, but they've got friends in places that make it hard to pin anything on them. You're lucky they left without anyone seriously hurt." Jack's jaw tightened, but he didn't respond. He'd seen this kind of apathy before, where the system worked just enough to keep appearances but rarely to deliver justice. The younger officer took a few notes, glancing at Samantha. "Did you see the whole thing?" "Yes," Samantha said firmly. "And Jack, Mr. Turner, only defended himself. They were the aggressors." The older officer nodded, but didn't seem entirely convinced. "We'll file a report, but don't expect much to come of it. They're probably long gone by now." "They said they'd be back," Samantha blurted out, her voice trembling slightly. "Their leader, Rex, he said, 'This isn't over.'" The officers exchanged a glance. "Noted," the older one said. He turned to Jack. "If they do come back, call us right away. Don't try to handle it yourself." Jack gave a faint, humorless smile. "I'll keep that in mind." The officers asked a few more questions, then left, their cruiser disappearing into the night. Samantha turned to Jack, her face still pale. "Do you think they'll come back?" she asked. Jack looked toward the highway, where the bikers had vanished. "Probably," he said. Samantha's eyes widened. "What are you going to do?" Jack shrugged, though his mind was already working. "Prepare." Jack returned to his modest home on the outskirts of town, a small, single-story house surrounded by overgrown grass and a weathered fence. Inside, the walls were bare, save for a few faded photographs. One showed Jack in his dress uniform, standing proudly beside his wife, Laura. Another featured a younger Jack with his unit, their faces full of camaraderie and purpose. He set the medal on the kitchen table, staring at it for a long moment. "Why did you even wear it today?" he thought. The medal had always been a private reminder, not something he flaunted. But something about the way Rex had mocked it stirred something in him. A need to defend not just himself, but everything it stood for. Jack's thoughts turned to the bikers' parting threat. He knew their type: bullies who thrived on intimidation and fear. Rex wasn't going to let this go. Jack opened a drawer, pulling out an old metal box. Inside were fragments of his past, dog tags, patches, and a photograph of Kyle Harper. Beneath them, nestled in a corner, was a utility knife. Jack picked it up, its weight familiar in his hand. He wasn't looking for a fight, but if the bikers came back, he wouldn't be caught off guard. Rex and his crew gathered at a secluded bar on the outskirts of town. Rex nursed a whiskey, his knuckles still red from where Jack had twisted his wrist. "That old bastard humiliated me," Rex growled, slamming his glass on the table. "You want us to go back now?" Snake Tattoo asked, rubbing his shoulder where he'd collided with the other biker. Not yet, Rex said, his lips curling into a malicious grin. We'll let him stew for a bit, but we're going to make sure he knows who's in charge. What's the plan? The brute with the shaved head asked. Rex leaned back in his chair, swirling the whiskey in his glass. We hit him where it hurts. Find out where he lives. Find out who he cares about. And when the time's right, he trailed off, letting the implication hang in the air. The gang laughed, their voices echoing in the dimly lit bar. Back at his house, Jack stood at his kitchen window, staring into the dark. He didn't know it yet, but the fight wasn't just about him anymore. It was about the town, the people like Samantha who were too scared to stand up to men like Rex. And Jack Turner was done running. The morning broke gray and overcast, as if the weather itself anticipated the brewing storm. Jack spent most of the night pacing, every instinct telling him Rex wouldn't let their confrontation go unanswered. By dawn, he had a plan. Years of military service had taught him that preparation was everything. And this time, the fight wasn't just about self-defense. It was about standing up to bullies like Rex and showing them their reign of terror wouldn't go unchecked. Samantha was working the early shift, bleary-eyed but determined. Jack walked in, carrying 2 steaming cups of coffee. You look like you need this, he said, handing her one. She smiled, though the worry lingered behind her eyes. Thanks. I didn't sleep much. Me neither, Jack admitted. You really think they'll come back? Jack nodded. Not just here. They'll be looking for ways to hurt me. Anyone connected to me. That includes you. Her eyes widened. But why? They barely know you. It's not about me, Jack said. It's about control. People like Rex don't back down because they think it makes them look weak. And when someone stands up to them, they make it personal. Samantha hesitated, then asked, What do we do? Jack set his coffee down on the counter. We don't wait for them. We make it clear that this town isn't theirs to push around anymore. Jack spent the day walking the town. It wasn't big, a few blocks of mom-and-pop shops, a diner, and a post office, but it had heart. Over the years, Jack had kept mostly to himself, but now he realized the fight against Rex wasn't just his alone. At the diner, he found Roy, a retired mechanic who used to fix the town's farm equipment. Roy's weathered face lit up when Jack walked in. Jack Turner, Roy said, setting down his coffee. Haven't seen you in a while. What brings you around? Jack sat across from him. Trouble. Biker gang called the Outlaws. They've been causing problems at the gas station. Roy's expression darkened. Heard about them. They've been running off local businesses with their protection racket. The hardware store owner closed up last month because of them. Jack leaned forward. I'm not letting them take over this town, but I can't do it alone. Roy studied him, then nodded. You've got guts, Jack. Count me in. By late afternoon, Jack's house was a hub of quiet activity. Roy arrived first, carrying an old toolbox filled with odds and ends. I figure you're going to need some reinforcements, Roy said, gesturing to the makeshift barricades Jack had started assembling. Not long after, a young man named Caleb showed up. He was one of Samantha's regulars at the station, a wiry kid with a mop of curly hair and a knack for fixing things. I heard what happened, Caleb said. I don't want those guys running us out of town. What can I do to help? By evening, Jack had a small but determined crew. Together, they reinforced the gas station's back door, set up cameras donated by a local tech enthusiast, and spread the word to keep an eye out for the outlaws. As Jack and the others worked, Rex and his gang were busy, too. Rex leaned against his motorcycle outside a rundown warehouse, scrolling through his phone. He'd spent the day gathering information on Jack Turner. What little he learned only fueled his hatred. Guy's a vet, Rex said to Snake Tattoo. Did a tour in Iraq. Lost his wife a few years back. Lives alone now. Snake Tattoo whistled. That why he's got a death wish? Rex smirked. No, but it gives us an advantage. He's got no one left to fight for. Except maybe that gas station chick. The brute with the shaved head chimed in. Rex's grin widened. Now there's an idea. We'll start with her. Let him know we're serious. Night fell, and Jack sat on his porch, the air heavy with tension. He knew Rex would come. If not tonight, then soon. The cameras were set up, the reinforcements ready. Samantha had even convinced her cousin, who ran the diner, to donate food for the crew. Feels like we're gearing up for a war, Caleb said as he tinkered with a motion sensor. Jack nodded, his eyes scanning the darkened street. In a way, we are. Roy chuckled. Well, if it's a war they want, they're messing with the wrong guy. Jack didn't smile. It's not just about me, he said quietly. This is about the town. If we let them win, they won't stop until they've taken everything. The group fell silent, the weight of Jack's words settling over them. Around midnight, the motion sensors beeped and the cameras lit up. Something's moving at the station, Caleb said, his voice taut with excitement and fear. Jack grabbed his jacket, motioning for the others to stay put. No way, Roy said, standing. We're with you. Jack hesitated, then nodded. Together, they piled into Roy's old truck and headed toward the gas station. As they approached, Jack's instinct screamed at him to stop. He motioned for Roy to cut the engine and park a block away. The station was eerily quiet, the neon sign buzzing faintly. Jack noticed the back door slightly ajar. They're here, Jack whispered. The group crept toward the building, hearts pounding. Inside, the shadows shifted, and a faint sound reached Jack's ears, laughter. Rex's gang was inside, their presence an unmistakable taunt. Jack tightened his grip on the utility knife in his pocket. They made the first move, he thought grimly. Now it's my turn. The group crouched near the gas station, the tension palpable. Jack held up a hand, signaling for silence as they crept closer. Inside, the muffled voices of Rex and his crew carried through the night air. Man, this place is a dump, Snake Tattoo muttered, kicking over a stack of oil cans. It's not about the place, Rex said, his voice sharp. It's about the message. You take what you want, and no one stops you. That's how we do things. Why are we even here? The old man isn't, the brute grumbled. Rex's grin was audible in his tone. He will be. And when he shows up, we'll remind him who's in charge. Outside, Jack gestured for Roy and Caleb to flank the building while he and Samantha approached the front. Samantha hesitated, her face pale in the dim light. You sure about this? She whispered. Jack nodded. Stay behind me. No heroics. The door jingled as Jack pushed it open, stepping into the fluorescent-lit station. The bikers turned, momentarily startled before recognizing him. Well, Rex drawled, leaning lazily against the counter. If it isn't the town hero. Jack didn't reply. His eyes swept the room, counting the bikers, 5, including Rex. His gaze lingered on the knife gleaming on the counter. You should have stayed home, old man, Rex continued. This is our town now. Jack stepped further into the room, his calm demeanor belying the tension coiled within him. You made a mistake coming here. The brute snorted. What are you going to do about it? Not just me, Jack said. At that moment, Roy and Caleb burst in from the back, wielding tools improvised as weapons, a tire iron and a length of pipe. Samantha followed, her phone raised to capture everything on video. You really want to go viral, she said, her voice trembling but defiant. The whole town's going to see this. Rex's grin faltered as his eyes darted to the camera. Turn that thing off. No, Samantha shot back, standing her ground. The bikers shifted uneasily, the bravado cracking. But Rex wasn't done. He stepped forward, pointing at Jack. You think this scares me? You don't know who you're messing with. Jack took a step closer, his voice low and steady. And you don't know who you're messing with. You come into my town, threaten my people, and think we'll just roll over? Not tonight. For a moment, silence hung heavy in the air, and then chaos erupted. The brute lunged at Jack, who sidestepped and drove an elbow into his ribs. Roy swung his tire iron, keeping another biker at bay, while Caleb darted between shelves, using his agility to his advantage. Samantha kept the camera rolling, her heart pounding as she documented every punch, every shout. Rex grabbed the knife from the counter, his face twisted with rage. You're dead, old man, he snarled, slashing toward Jack. Jack dodged, his movements precise and controlled, the result of years of training. He grabbed Rex's wrist, twisting it sharply until the knife clattered to the ground. This ends now, Jack growled, shoving Rex back. But Rex wasn't ready to back down. He scrambled to his feet, his gang regrouping behind him. "You're gonna regret this," he hissed, blood dripping from a cut on his lip. Jack stood firm, flanked by Roy and Caleb. "Walk away, Rex, while you still can." The threat hung in the air, and for a moment, it seemed Rex might charge again. But then he noticed the blinking red light on Samantha's phone, the evidence of their actions streaming straight to the cloud. "You're lucky tonight," Rex spat, backing toward the door. "But this isn't over." The bikers followed him out, their retreat more of a stumble than a march. As the roar of motorcycles faded into the night, Jack let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. "That was insane," Caleb said, his voice shaky. Roy clapped him on the back. "Kid, you did good." Samantha lowered her phone, her hands trembling. "Do you think they'll come back?" "They might," Jack admitted. "But now they know we won't back down." Samantha nodded, her fear giving way to determination. "And the town knows. I'll make sure everyone sees this." Jack sat alone on his porch, the adrenaline fading. The town was quiet again, but he knew the peace was temporary. Rex wasn't the kind to give up easily. Still, tonight was a victory, not just for him, but for the people who had stood with him. As he stared into the darkness, Jack felt something he hadn't in a long time: purpose. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, but tonight, he allowed himself a moment of hope. And as the first light of dawn crept over the horizon, Jack whispered to himself, "Let them come." The morning after the confrontation at the gas station, a strange tension hung in the air. Jack spent most of the day checking on the station and the reinforcements they had put in place. Caleb and Roy had returned home, but Samantha stayed behind, her determination to stand firm as unwavering as Jack's. "You think they'll really come back?" she asked as she wiped down the counter, her movements brisk but purposeful. "They're not just coming back," Jack replied, his voice grim. "They're coming back harder." True to Jack's instincts, Rex and his gang regrouped, their anger boiling over. In the dimly lit backroom of their hideout, Rex paced while Snake Tattoo leaned against a wall, lighting a cigarette. "This isn't just about the station anymore," Rex snarled. "It's about respect. That old man humiliated us in front of the whole town. If we don't do something big, we lose everything." Snake Tattoo exhaled a plume of smoke. "So, what's the play?" Rex stopped pacing, his eyes glinting with malicious intent. "We take it up a notch. Hit him where it hurts. And this time, we don't give him a chance to fight back." Jack was at home when the first sign of trouble came. His phone buzzed, a text from Samantha. "They're here, and they're not alone." Jack grabbed his jacket and keys, his heart pounding. By the time he arrived at the gas station, the scene was chaos. The outlaws had brought reinforcements, nearly a dozen bikers spread out across the parking lot. Rex stood at the center, barking orders as his crew smashed windows, tipped over shelves, and spray-painted their insignia on the walls. Jack stepped out of his truck, his jaw tightening as he took in the destruction. "Rex!" he bellowed, his voice cutting through the noise like a gunshot. The bikers froze, turning to face him. Rex smirked, stepping forward. "Nice of you to join us, Turner," he said, spreading his arms wide. "Like what we've done with the place?" Jack's hands clenched into fists. "You've made your point. Now leave." Rex's smirk widened. "Not yet. See, I don't think you've learned your lesson. But don't worry, I'm here to teach it to you." Jack's eyes flicked to Samantha, who was crouched behind the counter, clutching her phone. He gave her a small nod, silently urging her to stay put. "You've already lost, Rex," Jack said, his voice steady despite the tension. "The whole town saw what you did last night. They're not scared of you anymore." Rex laughed, the sound harsh and mocking. "That's where you're wrong. Fear isn't about what people see, it's about what they feel. And by the time we're done here, they'll remember who's in charge." The bikers began advancing, weapons in hand. Jack stood his ground, his mind racing. He was outnumbered and outgunned, but retreat wasn't an option. Before the situation could escalate, the roar of engines filled the air. Jack turned to see a convoy of vehicles pulling into the lot, trucks, cars, and even a few ATVs. Roy was at the front, leaning out of his truck's window. "Thought you might need some backup," he called. Behind him, townspeople spilled out, armed with tools, baseball bats, and even garden rakes. Caleb was among them, his wiry frame vibrating with nervous energy. The outlaws hesitated, their confidence wavering as they took in the growing crowd. "This is our town," Roy declared, stepping forward. "You want to fight? You've got one." The standoff felt like it lasted an eternity, but then Rex sneered, waving his gang back. "Fine," he said, his voice dripping with disdain. "We'll leave. For now. But this isn't over." As the outlaws retreated, the townspeople erupted into cheers, their unity a powerful force. Jack watched them go, his expression unreadable. He knew Rex wasn't finished, but for now, they had won another battle. That evening, Jack and Samantha sat on the gas station steps, watching as the townspeople cleaned up the mess. "You think they'll come back?" Samantha asked, her voice tinged with worry. "Probably," Jack admitted, "but they won't catch us off guard." Samantha smiled faintly. "You know, for someone who didn't want to get involved, you're pretty good at rallying people." Jack chuckled, the sound low and weary. "This town deserves better, and as long as I'm here, I'm going to make sure they get it." As the sun set, casting a warm glow over the battered but defiant station, Jack felt a flicker of hope. The fight wasn't over, but for the first time in years, he wasn't fighting alone. The day after the outlaws retreated, the town was abuzz with activity. The fight at the gas station had awakened something dormant in the townspeople, a sense of community and determination to protect their own. People came together to help clean up the damage, repair the station, and organize shifts to keep watch in case the gang returned. Jack stood by the door, observing as Roy directed volunteers. Samantha was taking pictures for her blog, documenting the town's efforts. Caleb worked alongside the others, his nervous energy now channeled into fixing the damage. "They're not just rebuilding the station," Samantha said, snapping a shot of a father and son replacing a shattered window. "They're rebuilding their pride." Jack nodded, his arms crossed. "It's good to see, but Rex isn't going to let this slide. He's already planning his next move." That evening, Jack called a meeting at the community center. The room was packed, farmers, store owners, teachers, and teenagers all eager to do their part. Jack stood at the front, his commanding presence silencing the murmurs of the crowd. "We've shown them we're not afraid," he began, his voice steady. "But we can't rely on one lucky win. If they come back, we need to be ready." "What do you suggest, Jack?" Roy asked from the front row. Jack unfolded a hand-drawn map of the town, spreading it out on a table. "We set up patrols around key areas, gas station, Main Street, and the outskirts. Keep an eye out for strangers and report anything suspicious. No one acts alone." "Do we really think they'll try again?" an older man asked. "They don't like losing," Jack replied, his gaze sweeping the room. "And they'll see this as a challenge to their authority. We've taken the first step, but we're not done yet." As the meeting dispersed, Jack walked Samantha back to her car. The night air was crisp, and the streets were unusually quiet. "You've really taken charge of this," Samantha said, her voice tinged with admiration. "It's like you've done this before." Jack hesitated, his eyes scanning the empty road. "In a way, I have. Different enemies, different battlefield, but the principles are the same." Samantha tilted her head, studying him. "You've seen a lot, haven't you?" "Enough to know when trouble's coming," he said quietly. She stopped by her car, leaning against the door. "You think you can handle this?" Jack met her gaze, his expression unreadable. "It's not about me. It's about the town, and we're not going to back down." Later that night, Jack sat on his porch, a mug of coffee in hand. The stars were bright, and the town seemed peaceful for the first time in days. But his instincts told him it wouldn't last. A distant sound broke the silence, the low rumble of motorcycles. Jack stiffened, setting his mug down. The noise grew louder, closer, until it echoed through the empty streets. Jack grabbed his jacket and stepped outside, scanning the horizon. The headlights of motorcycles appeared, a dozen of them this time, rolling into town like a swarm of locusts. He pulled out his phone and called Roy. "They're here," he said, his voice grim. "Rally the others. It's starting." The outlaws didn't attack immediately. Instead, They prowled through the streets, their engines roaring like predators marking their territory. They threw bottles at shop windows, spray-painted their insignia on walls, and shouted threats into the night. Jack followed them at a distance, staying out of sight but close enough to track their movements. His heart pounded as he realized their strategy. They weren't just targeting the station. They were targeting the entire town. As the outlaws made their way toward the gas station, they were met with an unexpected sight. The townspeople stood in the parking lot, armed with whatever they could find. Bats, crowbars, even farming tools. Roy stepped forward, his broad frame blocking the gang's path. "You want trouble," he called out. "You'll have to go through us." The bikers hesitated, their bravado faltering in the face of the united front. Rex, however, wasn't deterred. He revved his engine, glaring at the crowd. "You think this scares us?" he sneered. "You're just a bunch of small-town nobodies." Jack emerged from the shadows, his voice cutting through the tension. "Nobodies who aren't afraid of you." The standoff was electric, the tension thick enough to cut. Finally, Rex raised a hand, signaling his crew to stand down. "This isn't over," he said, his voice low and dangerous. "You think you've won, but you haven't. We'll be back, and next time, you won't see us coming." The gang retreated, their engines fading into the distance. The townspeople let out a collective breath, relief mingled with lingering fear. Jack turned to the crowd, his expression serious. "This was just a warning. They'll come back, and they'll be more dangerous next time. We need to stay vigilant." As the crowd dispersed, Jack's gaze lingered on the horizon, his mind racing. The battle was far from over, and he knew the next move had to be his. For now, the town was safe. But Jack couldn't shake the feeling that the real storm was just beginning. Jack spent the next morning in deep thought, pacing the gas station's parking lot as the townspeople finished the cleanup. The encounter the night before had confirmed his fears. The outlaws weren't just a threat to the gas station. They were determined to reclaim their dominance over the entire town. Samantha joined him, holding 2 cups of coffee. "You look like you're plotting something," she said, handing him a cup. "I am," Jack replied, his gaze fixed on the distant horizon. "If we keep waiting for them to make the first move, they'll catch us off guard. It's time to go on the offensive." Later that day, Jack called a meeting with Roy, Samantha, and Caleb. The group gathered in the station's back room, tension hanging heavy in the air. "You're saying we should take the fight to them?" Roy asked, raising an eyebrow. "That's exactly what I'm saying," Jack replied. "Rex and his gang have a hideout on the outskirts of town. We hit them there, disrupt their plans before they can regroup." Samantha frowned. "That sounds dangerous. What if they retaliate even harder?" "They're going to retaliate no matter what," Jack said. "The difference is, this time, we'll be in control." Caleb shifted nervously. "What exactly do you have in mind?" "We're not looking for a fight," Jack clarified. "This is about sending a message. We go in, disable their bikes, maybe wreck some of their supplies. Show them we're not afraid to strike back." Jack and Roy spent the afternoon recruiting volunteers. Not everyone was eager to join. Many townspeople were hesitant to provoke the gang further, but a handful of men and women, emboldened by the events of the past few days, agreed to help. "We're not soldiers," one of them said as they gathered tools and supplies. "No, we're not," Jack replied. "But neither are they. And we've got something they don't: each other." Samantha insisted on coming along to document the operation. Jack was reluctant but ultimately agreed, on the condition that she stayed back and didn't get involved directly. Under the cover of darkness, the group set out for the outlaws' hideout, a dilapidated warehouse just outside town. Jack led the way, his military training evident in the way he moved silently and signaled the others to follow. When they reached the edge of the property, they crouched behind a row of bushes, surveying the scene. The gang's motorcycles were lined up in the lot, their engines gleaming under the moonlight. A few bikers lingered outside, smoking and laughing, but most seemed to be inside the warehouse. Jack turned to the group, his voice barely above a whisper. "Roy, you and Caleb stay here and keep watch. The rest of us will handle the bikes." The team moved quickly and quietly, slashing tires, cutting wires, and pouring sand into gas tanks. The bikers outside were too distracted to notice the intruders slipping in and out of the shadows. Samantha stayed behind the bushes, her camera clicking softly as she documented the operation. She couldn't help but admire the precision and discipline Jack brought to the mission. Just as they were finishing, a loud crash came from inside the warehouse. Jack froze, his instincts kicking in. "What was that?" one of the bikers outside asked, his head snapping toward the noise. "Probably Rex throwing a tantrum," another replied with a laugh. Jack motioned for his team to retreat, but as they turned to leave, a flashlight beam swept across the lot, landing squarely on Caleb. "Hey, who's there?" The bikers sprang into action, shouting and chasing after the group. Jack barked orders, guiding the team toward the tree line. Caleb tripped over a root, but Roy was there in an instant, hauling him to his feet. Samantha ducked behind a tree, her heart pounding as the chaos unfolded. Jack stayed at the rear, using his knowledge of the terrain to lead the bikers away from the others. By the time they regrouped on the outskirts of town, everyone was breathless but unharmed. "That was too close," Samantha said, her voice shaking. Jack nodded, his expression grim. "But we did what we came to do. They'll think twice before coming after us again." The next morning, the outlaws woke to discover the extent of the damage. Rex's fury was palpable as he stomped around the lot, kicking at disabled bikes and cursing loudly. "They're playing with fire," he growled, his eyes blazing with rage. "And they're about to get burned." Back in town, the group celebrated their small victory, but the mood was far from jubilant. Everyone knew the retaliation would come, and the stakes were higher than ever. Jack stood on the porch of the gas station, watching as the townspeople prepared for the inevitable. Samantha joined him, her camera hanging around her neck. "You think we did the right thing?" she asked. Jack sighed, his gaze distant. "Right or wrong doesn't matter anymore. What matters is that we're ready for whatever comes next." As the sun set, casting long shadows over the town, Jack felt a familiar tension in his chest, the calm before the storm. The days following their sabotage of the outlaws' hideout were tense. Jack and his team had sent a clear message, but now the town awaited retaliation. They had poked the bear, and there was no doubt in Jack's mind that the outlaws were gearing up for something bigger. It was late afternoon when the first sign of trouble appeared. A dust cloud rose over the main road leading into town, and the rumble of engines soon followed. Jack was sitting on the porch of the gas station, his eyes narrowed. "Here they come," he muttered to himself. Within moments, the outlaws stormed into town. This time, there were more of them. At least 24 bikers, all looking like they'd been itching for a fight. They tore down the main street, revving their engines and swerving dangerously close to parked cars. The sight was enough to send the town's residents into a flurry of nervous activity, some running inside, others standing frozen in place. Jack quickly pulled out his phone and dialed Roy. "They're here," Jack said. "We need to act fast." Roy had already anticipated this moment, and within minutes, he gathered the townspeople who had previously volunteered to stand watch. They hid behind parked cars, in alleyways, and in storefronts, prepared to protect the town from whatever the outlaws had planned. The outlaws slowed as they reached the center of town, Rex at the front, his eyes scanning the scene like a predator eyeing its prey. He grinned, clearly pleased to see the town on edge. Well, Rex called out, his voice amplified by the megaphone he held. "You think you can just mess with us and get away with it?" Jack stood on the steps of the gas station, a calm yet defiant presence. He stepped forward, meeting Rex's gaze head-on. "We didn't start this," Jack called back, "but we're not afraid of you." Rex's grin widened, and for a moment, there was a palpable silence as tension thickened the air. Then, without warning, Rex signaled to his men. The outlaws surged forward, tearing through the streets and knocking over trash cans, breaking windows, and spraying graffiti on walls. Jack didn't hesitate. "Now!" he shouted. The townspeople, who had been waiting in the shadows, emerged in a coordinated effort. They surrounded the bikers, cutting off their routes of escape. A few skirmishes broke out as some of the bikers tried to push their way through, but the townsfolk stood their ground. The situation quickly escalated. A biker charged at Jack, swinging a bat, but Jack sidestepped and landed a quick punch to his gut. The biker crumpled, dazed. Another biker swung at Roy, but Roy caught the bat mid-swing and twisted it out of his hands, sending the man sprawling to the ground. Caleb, his nerves steadied by the adrenaline, lunged at another biker who had tried to grab Samantha's camera. With a swift kick to the back of the knee, the biker dropped, clutching his leg in pain. Samantha, meanwhile, wasn't just an observer anymore. She captured everything on film, documenting the chaos, the resolve of the townspeople, and the relentless aggression of the outlaws. The bikers realized they were outnumbered and began retreating, but Rex wasn't finished. He barked orders, and the outlaws pushed forward again, determined to intimidate the townspeople. Jack moved quickly, his military instincts kicking in. "They're not leaving until they think they've won," he said to Roy. "We need to stop them now." He turned to the group of townspeople. "We can't just defend ourselves. We need to push them out. Are you with me?" "We're with you," Roy said, his voice filled with determination. With a rallying cry, the townspeople surged forward. The outlaws were caught off guard, their confidence faltering as they realized they were facing a unified resistance. In the chaos, Jack saw Rex making a break for his bike. It was his chance to end this once and for all. Jack sprinted toward the street where Rex was heading, ducking behind parked cars and dodging obstacles. Rex's bike roared to life as he revved the engine, trying to escape the mess he had caused. But Jack was faster, catching up just as Rex pulled out onto the main road. "You're not going anywhere," Jack shouted, pulling his gun and firing a warning shot into the air. Rex's bike swerved in surprise, but he regained control, his eyes flashing with fury. "You think you can scare me with that?" he spat. "You're nothing." Jack didn't answer. Instead, he aimed his gun at the tires of Rex's bike, firing another shot. The front tire blew out with a loud pop, sending Rex careening into the dirt. The other bikers, seeing their leader fall, began to retreat, their pride wounded. Jack didn't lower his gun until he was sure the threat was gone. With the outlaws retreating once more, the town began to breathe easier. There was damage, yes, broken windows, knocked over fences, and a few bruised egos. But they had stood their ground. They had fought back. Jack walked back to the gas station, his heart still racing from the confrontation. Samantha caught up to him, camera in hand. "Are you sure they're gone?" she asked, her voice tinged with uncertainty. "For now," Jack replied. "But we've made a statement. They know we're not going to back down." Roy clapped Jack on the back. "We did good, Jack. But don't think this is over. We'll need to stay vigilant." Jack nodded. "I know. But this town, this community, we've got something they don't. We've got each other." As night fell, the town began to settle back into its usual rhythm. But Jack couldn't shake the feeling that the outlaws were just biding their time, waiting for the perfect moment to strike again. And when they did, Jack knew one thing for sure: the town would be ready. As he looked out over the quiet streets, a new sense of resolve filled him. He wasn't just fighting for himself anymore. He was fighting for the people who had put their trust in him. The war wasn't over. It had only just begun. The sun rose slowly over the town, casting a golden glow across the streets. Despite the chaos of the previous night, things seemed almost peaceful, almost too peaceful. But Jack knew better. The outlaws weren't the type to back down so easily. The threat wasn't gone. It was merely waiting to unfold. For the next few days, life in the town returned to a cautious normalcy. The gas station was busy with regulars, and the town shops slowly resumed their business. People talked in hushed tones, exchanging nervous glances whenever a motorcycle passed by, but there was no sign of the outlaws. It felt like the calm before a storm, and Jack couldn't shake the tension gnawing at the back of his mind. He spent most of his days at the gas station, watching the horizon, waiting for the inevitable retaliation. Samantha stopped by frequently, her camera now a permanent fixture on her shoulder. She seemed to share his unease, though she did her best to stay focused on documenting the town's recovery. "Do you think they're planning something?" she asked one morning, as they sat in the back office, reviewing footage. "I don't know," Jack said, rubbing his chin, "but I wouldn't bet on them leaving us alone. They'll come back when we least expect it." She looked up from her camera, locking eyes with him. "And when they do, Will we be ready? Jack paused. We have to be. On the fourth day after the outlaws' attack, as Jack was cleaning the garage, a car pulled up to the gas station. It wasn't one of the regulars. The car was black, sleek, and unmarked, more like something out of a spy movie than a small-town arrival. The engine cut off, and the door opened slowly. Jack straightened, his instincts kicking in. He stepped out from the garage and approached cautiously, trying to get a better look at the visitor. A man in a well-tailored suit stepped out of the car, looking out of place in the rustic town. He wore sunglasses, despite the cloudy sky. "Can I help you?" Jack called, his voice steady but alert. The man looked up, removing his sunglasses, revealing sharp blue eyes. "Jack Walker?" he asked in a tone that was too smooth for comfort. "That's me," Jack replied, crossing his arms. "Who are you?" The man smiled faintly. "Name's Cole Davidson. I'm here to talk business." Cole Davidson had a certain air of confidence that Jack immediately recognized as trouble. He wasn't from around here. There was no way someone like him would visit a small town like this without an agenda. "You're not from around here," Jack said, studying him. "What kind of business are you talking about?" Cole's smile remained, but it didn't reach his eyes. "Let's just say I know about the outlaws, and I think you're making a big mistake by getting involved." Jack tensed. "I don't know what you mean." "Let me be clear," Cole said, his voice low and measured. "I can make the outlaws go away, for good. But you'll have to listen to me. I have resources, connections, a simple deal. All I need is your cooperation." Jack's mind raced. Who was this guy? Why was he offering to help? And at what cost? And what would you want in return? Jack asked carefully. Cole's eyes glinted, and he took a step closer. "You need protection. The outlaws are a loose cannon, and they'll tear this town apart if you don't stop them. I'm offering you a way out, a way to deal with them without bloodshed. You just need to follow my lead." Jack hesitated. "Why would I trust you?" Cole's smile didn't falter. "Because, Jack, you don't have a choice. The outlaws aren't done with you, and sooner or later, they'll burn this place to the ground. I can stop that, if you let me." Cole didn't stay long. After his cryptic offer, he turned on his heel and left just as quickly as he came. Jack watched him drive off, the unsettling feeling in his gut growing. "Who was that?" Samantha asked, having emerged from the office. "Someone who thinks he can buy us out," Jack replied. "You're not thinking of accepting, are you?" she pressed, concern in her voice. Jack exhaled slowly. "I don't know yet. The guy doesn't seem like he's offering anything for free, but I'll have to consider what he's suggesting." She gave him a skeptical look. "You don't trust him, do you?" "No," Jack said firmly. "But I can't ignore the fact that he might have the power to help us, if we need it." For the next few hours, Jack couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. Cole's words echoed in his mind, but Jack refused to jump to conclusions. It was only a matter of time before the outlaws made their move, and Jack knew that the town had to be prepared. Meanwhile, the townspeople grew more nervous. Even though the outlaws hadn't shown up again, the fear lingered in the air, a heavy cloud that seemed to hang over everything. Samantha kept pushing Jack to make a decision, but he kept putting it off. The clock was ticking, and every minute felt like a countdown. The tension was palpable, and the air felt thick with the knowledge that whatever happened next could change everything. That evening, a phone call confirmed Jack's worst fears. Roy had spotted a group of outlaws coming into town from the north. This time, there were no subtlety, no slow rumblings of a distant threat. The outlaws were coming, and they weren't going to stop until they had their revenge. Jack gathered everyone. The time had come. They needed to make a decision, stand and fight, or trust Cole Davidson's dangerous offer. "I don't know if we can keep doing this on our own," Jack admitted to Roy as they watched the approaching bikes. "We've lost a lot of ground, and the outlaws won't stop until they've crushed us." Roy shook his head. "But letting someone like Cole take over, it's not who we are, Jack." "I know," Jack replied. "But sometimes, we have to make hard choices. We've come this far, but the question is, can we keep going?" The storm was coming, and Jack knew this time, it wouldn't be a storm they could outrun. The tension in the air was palpable. It was as if the entire town held its breath, waiting for the inevitable clash. The outlaws were coming. This time, there would be no escape. Jack could feel the weight of every decision bearing down on him. The threat was no longer just a distant possibility. It was at their doorstep. As the bikes neared, Jack rallied the town's defenders. There were more this time. At least 3 dozen outlaws riding through the main street, roaring past the empty storefronts. Jack could hear their engines growing louder, a deafening noise that made his pulse quicken. "We don't have much time," Jack said, gathering Roy, Caleb, and a handful of others. "They're coming fast. We need to be ready." Everyone understood the gravity of the situation. The town was about to face a full-on assault. The stakes had never been higher. The townspeople, who had been preparing for a possible confrontation, now set up defenses in earnest. They armed themselves with whatever they could find: baseball bats, crowbars, and even a few firearms that had been kept in secret. They positioned themselves in key spots, ready to defend their homes, their businesses, and each other. Jack found Samantha once again, standing in the back of the gas station. She had her camera in hand, but the usual sense of determination in her eyes was now tinged with fear. "I'm not sure how much more of this we can take," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. Jack looked her in the eye, his tone steady. "We've made it this far. We're not backing down now." She nodded, though the doubt still lingered. "But what if it's not enough?" As the first biker made his way into the center of town, the whole place seemed to freeze. The rest followed, their tires kicking up dust, their faces hidden behind dark helmets. Rex was in the lead, his grin as menacing as ever. He wasn't here for a conversation. He was here for a war. Jack stood at the front, flanked by Roy and Caleb. His heart pounded, but his mind was clear. There was no turning back. Rex slowed his bike as he reached the center of the street, and the other outlaws followed suit. For a moment, the air was thick with anticipation, like the calm before the storm. "You've been warned, Jack," Rex called out, his voice carrying through the dead silence. "This is your last chance to back down. You don't want this fight." Jack's eyes never left Rex's face. "You started this, Rex, and we're not backing down." The air crackled with tension. Rex's gaze darkened, and he revved his engine. "So be it," he spat. "You wanted a war, and you're going to get one." In a flash, the outlaws charged forward, their bikes roaring to life, the sound deafening. The town's defenders were ready, but there was no way to prepare for the sheer force of the outlaws' attack. The bikers swerved through the streets, knocking over barriers and aiming for the gas station. "Hold your ground," Jack yelled, his voice cutting through the chaos. Roy, Caleb, and a few others charged forward, engaging the bikers head-on. Jack and Samantha dove behind the gas station's outer wall, using it for cover. The outlaws were no longer just a gang. They were a well-coordinated force, working together to break through the town's defenses. The first wave of bikers crashed into the barricades, knocking over a few cars and scattering the townspeople. Jack took aim at one of the riders and fired a shot into the air, warning them off. But Rex wasn't interested in warnings. He was focused on the destruction, the chaos. Samantha's camera clicked as she caught every moment of the attack. Her heart was racing, her hands shaking, but she couldn't tear herself away from the lens. This was history unfolding, painful, but important. Jack saw Roy and Caleb struggling to hold the line as more bikers poured into the streets. They were vastly outnumbered, but they didn't falter. They fought back with everything they had, but it was clear the outlaws weren't going to give up easily. Jack scanned the scene, looking for any way to turn the tide. That's when he saw it, a truck parked near the edge of town, with a heavy-duty winch attached to the front. If they could get it working, they might be able to pull down some of the buildings they'd fortified or block the streets with debris. Without wasting a second, Jack sprinted toward the truck. Samantha watched Jack go, her instincts telling her to follow. She darted after him, her camera still in hand. She was more than just a bystander now. She was part of this fight. As Jack reached the truck, he didn't hesitate. He climbed into the driver's seat, started the engine, and began to power up the winch. The sound of the motor revving was drowned out by the roar of the outlaws' bikes, but Jack's focus was unshakable. Samantha reached the truck just in time to see the winch cable snap into place. "What are you doing?" she shouted over the noise. "We need to take out their bikes," Jack replied, his voice firm. "We stop them here, or it's over." With a sudden jerk, the winch pulled forward, dragging a stack of debris into the street, blocking the path of the oncoming bikers. The outlaws were forced to swerve, but the trap had been set. Rex, now on foot, saw what was happening and charged toward the truck. He was furious, his fists clenched. "You think you can stop us with that?" he roared. Jack didn't answer. He fired a warning shot at the ground, sending Rex skidding to a stop. "We don't have to stop you, Rex. You're the one who's already lost." Rex glared, but his face twisted with frustration. The outlaws were retreating, slowly but surely. The tide had turned. Jack had made the decision to fight, and they had fought back harder than anyone had expected. As the bikers retreated, Jack could feel the weight of the battle lift. The fight was far from over, but for now, the town had won. The townspeople, exhausted but relieved, began to come out of hiding. The outlaws were gone, for now, but Jack knew they wouldn't stay away forever. "We held our ground," Roy said, clapping Jack on the back. "Yeah, but for how long?" Jack replied, his gaze turning toward the horizon. The calm might have returned to the town, but Jack's instincts told him the storm wasn't over. They had won this battle, but the war? That was still to come. As the sun set, the town stood united. The outlaws had learned that they were not just fighting a gas station owner and a few locals. They were fighting for their homes, for their families. Jack wasn't going to let them win. Not now, not ever. And when the next wave came, they would be ready. The dust was settling, but the bruises and scars from the battle lingered in the air. The smell of burnt rubber and gasoline still hung thick in the streets, a reminder of the chaos that had just unfolded. The small town had seen its first real taste of war, and while they had held their ground, the cost of victory was heavy. By the time the sun dipped below the horizon, the townspeople had begun to assess the damage. The street was littered with debris, broken glass, and remnants of motorcycles that had been abandoned in the retreat. Several buildings had been damaged in the fight, and the gas station had taken a significant hit. Jack surveyed the scene, his mind racing as he tried to piece everything together. Samantha was the first to approach him, her camera now hanging around her neck. She was silent for a moment, taking in the destruction before speaking. "This is going to change everything," she said quietly. "The outlaws are going to be back, and they'll bring more with them." Jack nodded. He knew this wasn't over. Not by a long shot. The town had fought back, but they had only scratched the surface of the problem. The outlaws wouldn't give up. "We've bought ourselves some time," Jack replied, looking at the others as they worked to clear debris and help the wounded. "But not much." Samantha glanced around. "What now? What's the plan?" Jack was quiet for a moment, his eyes scanning the horizon. It was a simple question, but the answer wasn't so clear. "We prepare for what's coming," he said finally, his voice grim. "We make this town as hard to take as possible, and we make sure the outlaws know we're not afraid to fight back." Back at the gas station, Roy was tending to Caleb's arm, which had been grazed by a bullet during the fight. The wound wasn't serious, but it was enough to slow him down. "How's it looking?" Jack asked, walking up to them. "Nothing we can't handle," Roy replied, nodding at Caleb. "But we're gonna need more supplies. Medical stuff, weapons, and some backup." Jack considered Roy's words carefully. The town was low on resources, and while they had done their best to fortify their positions, there was no way they could face the outlaws again without more help. The reality of the situation was sinking in. Fighting back wasn't going to be as easy as they'd hoped. "We're going to need outside help," Jack said. "I don't like it, but it's the only way. I'll contact someone." Roy looked up sharply. "Who are you calling?" Jack hesitated. He didn't want to bring in outsiders, not after everything that had happened. But he knew it was the only option. "I'm calling Cole." Roy's face hardened. "The guy who offered us a deal?" "Yeah," Jack said, his tone even. "He might be the only one who can help us prepare for what's coming." The next morning, Cole Davidson returned. He was dressed in his usual black suit, his calm demeanor as unnerving as ever. Jack didn't waste any time. "You said you could help," Jack said bluntly, standing at the door of the gas station. "Now's the time. We need everything. Ammo, weapons, manpower." If you can't deliver, we're on our own. Cole's eyes narrowed, but his smile remained. Of course, Jack. I wouldn't have offered if I couldn't deliver. But, like I said before, you'll need to follow my lead. Jack didn't flinch. We're not following anyone. We're making our own choices from here on out. You help us, and that's it. Cole chuckled softly. Fair enough. But understand something, Jack. You can't win this fight alone. The outlaws won't just back off because you've got a few extra guns. They'll come back harder. You'll need to be prepared for more than just a street brawl. Jack crossed his arms, his jaw clenched. I don't care what it takes. I won't let them destroy this town. Cole looked at him, his eyes calculating. I'll give you what you need, but don't say I didn't warn you. Once you make this deal, there's no turning back. Jack hesitated. He knew Cole was right. This wasn't a fight they could win with just determination. They needed more. And, for better or worse, Cole was offering that. Fine, Jack said, his voice firm. But this is your one shot. Help us, or get out. The supplies started arriving in the days that followed. Guns, ammunition, equipment, and even a few hired hands who knew how to fight. The town's defenses grew stronger, and for the first time since the outlaws had appeared, there was a glimmer of hope. But the cost of victory weighed heavily on Jack. He had made a deal with someone who wasn't exactly trustworthy, and every time he looked at the weapons and resources, he felt a deep unease. He spent long hours with Roy and Caleb, preparing the town for what was to come. They fortified the gas station, set up additional defenses around key buildings, and ensured the townspeople knew how to handle themselves in case of another attack. But there was always that nagging feeling in the back of Jack's mind. They were building something, but what would happen once the dust settled? Would they be able to take back control of their town? Or would they be under the thumb of someone like Cole Davidson forever? With everything in place, the town settled into a brief lull. The outlaws hadn't returned, and the town took this time to rebuild, to regain some semblance of normalcy. But Jack knew it wouldn't last. The outlaws would come back, stronger, angrier, and more determined to crush them. It was a delicate balance now. The town was stronger, but so was their enemy. Jack could only hope that when the time came, they would be ready. And yet, even as the preparations continued, a sense of dread hung over the town. They had won a battle, but the war was far from over. The cost of victory had been high, and Jack wondered if they would be able to pay the price for long. For now, though, the town remained intact. But deep down, Jack knew they were standing on the edge of something far darker than they could ever imagine. The days following Cole's arrival were tense but oddly peaceful. The town, though on edge, took the brief respite to regroup. Repairs were underway, and the barricades that had been hastily set up after the last battle were reinforced. The gas station, once a symbol of the conflict, was now a hub of survival. Yet, in the back of Jack's mind, he knew it was just a matter of time before the outlaws came back with even more force. Jack sat in the corner of the gas station, a map spread out in front of him. Roy and Caleb sat nearby, discussing strategies for how best to fortify the gas station's perimeter. But Jack's mind wasn't on the maps or plans. It was on the uneasy deal they'd struck with Cole. He'd watched the way Cole moved in and out of town, always calm, always calculating. Jack didn't trust him, not by a long shot. But he'd needed Cole's resources. The town needed them. And now, he couldn't undo the deal. Jack, Caleb's voice broke through his thoughts. You all right? Jack looked up, forcing a smile. Yeah, just thinking. Roy, who had been silent up until now, glanced over. About Cole? Jack nodded, feeling the weight of the question. I don't like it. I don't like that we're relying on him. He's got his own agenda, and I'm not sure we're part of it. Caleb leaned back in his chair, his fingers drumming on the table. I get it, man, but we need the muscle, and we need to be ready for when they come back. Roy's face darkened. We're already ready. The town's fortified. The people know what they're up against. We'll stand our ground. Jack's gaze hardened as he folded the map. That's the problem. We're standing, not fighting. We can't just wait for them to come to us. We need to take the fight to them. Caleb raised an eyebrow. You mean going after them? Jack nodded. Exactly. We've been sitting here for too long, letting them control the game. We need to find out where they're holed up and hit them before they can hit us again. Roy and Caleb exchanged a look. It's risky, Roy said quietly. Jack's tone was unwavering. It's the only option we have. The next few days were a blur of preparation. Jack, Roy, and Caleb worked closely with the few townspeople who had military or law enforcement experience. They gathered intel on the outlaws' movements and mapped out potential locations where they might be hiding. The plan was simple: hit them hard and fast before they could mobilize. Samantha, ever the journalist, was reluctant to get involved but still hovered around, documenting the preparations. She'd seen firsthand the destruction the outlaws had caused, and though she didn't fully agree with Jack's approach, she understood the urgency. "I'm not going to sit on the sidelines this time," Samantha told Jack one morning as she approached him with her camera. "You can't expect everyone to just stand here while you go off risking your life." Jack met her gaze, his jaw clenched. "I'm not asking anyone to come with me. I'm not even asking for help. I'm doing what has to be done." She didn't back down. "Maybe, but I'll be documenting it. You don't get to tell the story from behind the scenes." Jack shook his head, but there was something in his eyes, something that softened just a little. "Fine, but stay out of the way." Samantha raised her eyebrows. "I'll do my best." The night before the raid, the air felt different. The town, normally quiet and peaceful, was tense. People gathered in their homes, checking their weapons, tightening bolts on barricades. Jack, unable to sleep, walked the streets one last time. The moonlight cast long shadows across the town, and every creak of the wind felt like a warning. He stopped in front of the gas station and gazed at the bullet holes still visible in the walls. The battle had been brutal, but it had also been a wake-up call. The outlaws were ruthless, and Jack couldn't afford to underestimate them again. He knew the fight would take its toll on him, on the town, and on everyone who had chosen to stand and fight. There was no going back. Suddenly, he heard a soft rustle behind him. He turned, his hand instinctively reaching for the gun holstered at his side. "Samantha," he said, recognizing her figure in the shadows. She approached slowly, her camera slung over her shoulder. "Can't sleep either, huh?" Jack nodded. "It's not easy, you know?" She met his gaze, and for a moment, there was an unspoken understanding between them. "I know, but you've done what you can. Now we just wait for the morning." Jack chuckled darkly. "I've never been good at waiting." Samantha smiled faintly. "You'll have to get used to it. We all will." The following morning arrived in a blur of activity. The town was quiet, almost too quiet, as everyone took their positions. Jack, Roy, Caleb, and a handful of others prepared for the assault, their eyes focused, their nerves steely. Jack's plan was simple: hit fast, hit hard, and take out the outlaws before they had a chance to regroup. They would strike at dawn when the outlaws were still disorganized and unprepared. As the sun broke over the horizon, Jack and his team moved out, heading for the first of several strategic locations they believed the outlaws might be hiding. It wasn't long before they found it, the old warehouse on the outskirts of town, surrounded by thick trees and shrouded in mist. It was silent, almost too silent. Jack signaled for everyone to stop. He glanced around, his instincts telling him something was off. "Stay sharp," he murmured. "This doesn't feel right." But before they could move, the ground seemed to shake beneath their feet. Engines roared to life in the distance, and the unmistakable sound of motorcycles reverberated through the air. The outlaws were already here. Jack's heart raced, his hand tightening around his gun. The time had come. The storm was upon them. The roar of motorcycle engines broke the stillness of the morning. Jack's blood ran cold as the sound grew louder, closer. His heart pounded in his chest, but his eyes remained focused on the horizon. The outlaws were here, and they weren't coming quietly. Jack raised his hand, signaling his group to take cover. The warehouse, their first target, was only a few hundred yards away, but now the outlaws were in full force, speeding toward them. Jack's gut twisted. They had no time to reach their objective before the outlaws descended on the town. "They're coming fast," Roy hissed, his voice low but tense. "We need to get to cover and wait for them to pass." "No," Jack snapped, his voice sharp. "We hit them now, before they get organized. We don't have the luxury of waiting." The plan had always been to strike first, but this was different. The outlaws weren't scattered. They were coordinated, powerful, and clearly ready for a fight. Jack had known they would return, but he hadn't expected them to come this hard and fast. From the woods, a dozen motorcycles emerged, kicking up dust as they charged down the dirt road toward the town. They weren't just riders, they were soldiers, each one armed and ready for battle. Jack could feel the weight of the moment press down on him. This was what he had been preparing for, but even then, the odds were stacked against them. "We need to split up," Jack ordered. "Roy, Caleb, take the left flank. Samantha, stay close to me. We'll take the center." Samantha nodded without a word, already moving into position with her camera in hand. Despite the situation, Jack couldn't help but feel a sense of unease about having her involved in the fight. She wasn't a soldier, she was a journalist, but he didn't have time to argue. The outlaws charged forward, their engines howling as they made their approach. Jack waited until the first few bikes were almost upon them. Then, without hesitation, he pulled the trigger. The sound of gunfire split the air as Jack and his team opened fire. The outlaws had no time to react, and two of them went down immediately, their bikes skidding out of control. The others didn't slow down, though. They swerved and dodged, returning fire in the process. The air was thick with smoke and dust, and the sound of gunshots echoed through the trees. Jack kept his focus, moving quickly as he darted behind cover. His heart raced as the adrenaline hit, but he didn't let it consume him. The outlaws were fast and brutal, but they weren't invincible. He could feel the pressure of every move he made, every decision hanging in the balance. Beside him, Samantha crouched low, keeping her camera steady as she filmed the chaos unfolding around them. Jack didn't have time to wonder what she was thinking. This was survival. From the corner of his eye, Jack saw Roy and Caleb working in perfect sync, their shots precise as they took out one outlaw after another. But the outlaws were regrouping, pulling back and circling around to the other side. Jack could see them trying to flank. "They're trying to box us in," Jack muttered under his breath. "We need to move." But just as he was about to order a retreat, something caught his eye. A massive figure, larger than the rest, cut through the smoke, leading the charge. Jack's pulse quickened as he recognized the man in the front. It was none other than the outlaws' leader, a towering figure known as Viper. Jack had heard stories about him, about his cold, calculating nature and his brutal tactics. He was no ordinary thug. He was the kind of man who thrived on chaos, and now he was coming straight for them. Viper's eyes locked on Jack, and a wicked grin spread across his face. "Well, well," he shouted over the roar of the engines. "Looks like you've brought a fight to us. I didn't think you had the guts." Jack didn't flinch. "You're not taking this town. Not today, not ever." Viper's grin widened as he revved the engine of his bike. "We'll see about that." The battle raged on as both sides fought furiously for control. Jack's team was giving everything they had, but the outlaws were relentless. For every one of them they took down, two more seemed to appear. The motorcycles sped around, weaving in and out of cover, making them harder to target. The outlaws were closing in, pushing Jack's team back toward the gas station. But Jack wasn't ready to retreat. Not yet. He had to stop Viper before they were completely overrun. With a sharp motion, Jack signaled to Roy and Caleb. "We're going after Viper. Now." Roy looked at him, his brow furrowed. "Jack, it's too dangerous. We don't have enough ammo." Jack's eyes were cold, determined. "We don't need ammo. We just need to hit him first." Caleb, understanding the urgency, nodded. "Let's do it." They sprinted forward, ducking low as they moved through the chaos. Viper was just ahead, still leading his gang in their assault. Jack could see him now, riding his bike with the same savage confidence he had always exuded. But this time, Jack wouldn't let him escape. They approached from the side, closing in on Viper's bike as he slowed down momentarily, thinking he had the upper hand. Without warning, Jack lunged. He grabbed the rear of Viper's bike, yanking it to the side, causing the large rider to lose balance. Viper grunted in anger, pulling his gun, but it was too late. Jack was already on him, his fists flying. The struggle between Jack and Viper was brutal, raw, and personal. Viper swung a heavy fist at Jack's face, but Jack dodged, tackling him to the ground. They rolled in the dirt, each one fighting for control. "You think you can take me?" Viper growled, pinning Jack beneath him. Jack gritted his teeth, feeling the weight of Viper pressing down on him. "I don't have to take you," Jack spat, shoving Viper off with all his strength. "I just have to stop you." With a surge of energy, Jack stood and grabbed Viper's gun, twisting it out of his hand. He pointed it at Viper, his chest heaving from the fight. "This town belongs to us," Jack said, his voice steady. "And you're not welcome here anymore." Viper glared at him, but there was something in his eyes now, something that told Jack the fight was over. He knew when to retreat. Without another word, Viper raised his hands in surrender. "This isn't over, Jack," he muttered, his voice full of venom. "You've just made things a hell of a lot worse." Jack didn't flinch. "I'll be ready." With that, Viper's gang retreated, their leader's pride hurt but their strength undiminished. For now, the town had won. But the price of victory was clear. This was only the beginning. The dust began to settle as the sound of engines and gunfire faded into the distance. Jack stood at the center of the battlefield, his breath heavy, his clothes torn and stained with dirt and blood. The roar of the outlaws had finally ceased, but the weight of what had just transpired hung in the air. The town had fought back, but at what cost? The gas station was a war zone. Bullet holes marred the walls, and debris was scattered everywhere. Jack could hear the low murmurs of the townspeople, their voices filled with both relief and unease. They had held their ground, but it was clear that the battle wasn't over, not by a long shot. Jack surveyed the scene, his eyes scanning the wounded. A few of the townspeople had been injured, some more seriously than others. Caleb was already moving among them, assisting where he could, his face grim but determined. Roy was speaking with the few remaining fighters, making sure everyone was accounted for. Samantha was snapping pictures, her camera clicking in rapid succession, though her usual detached professionalism seemed to falter as she captured the destruction around them. Jack couldn't help but feel a pang of guilt when he saw her, but he quickly pushed the thought aside. There were bigger things to worry about now. He walked toward Roy, who had been by his side through every step of the battle. "You good?" Jack asked, his voice rough from the adrenaline and exhaustion. Roy nodded, though his face was etched with fatigue. "We lost some good people, but we're standing. That counts for something." Jack glanced at the gas station, then back to Roy. "For now, but they'll be back. We can't just sit here and wait for them to regroup. We need to keep the pressure on." Roy hesitated, his eyes shifting as he looked around. "Jack, I know you want to keep fighting, but we need time to recover. We're not in a position to take them on again just yet." Jack's jaw tightened. He knew Roy was right, but it didn't sit well with him. The outlaws wouldn't give them that luxury. "We don't have time," Jack muttered. "If we don't hit them hard now, they'll just come back stronger. I'm not letting them take this town." Roy studied him for a long moment, then finally sighed. "I hear you, but we can't go in blind. We need a real plan, Jack. We need to be smart about this." Jack nodded, though he didn't feel any better about it. The truth was, Roy was right. They couldn't just rush in headfirst again. They needed to regroup, to gather intel, and to figure out what the outlaws were really planning. But Jack couldn't shake the feeling that the storm was far from over. Just as Jack was about to speak, a familiar figure approached. Cole. His large frame appeared in the distance, striding toward the gas station with purpose. Jack tensed, but Roy was the first to speak. "You're just in time for the cleanup crew," he said, his tone cool but wary. Cole's eyes flicked over the damage, and then he met Jack's gaze. "I told you I could help. Looks like you could use it." Jack didn't respond immediately, his mind racing. He wasn't sure what to make of Cole's offer. On one hand, the man had proven useful during the fight, but Jack still didn't trust him. Cole had his own agenda, and Jack wasn't sure where that fit in with the town's survival. "What's the plan now?" Cole asked, his voice low but steady. Jack exchanged a glance with Roy, then reluctantly spoke. "We need to assess what we've lost, patch up the wounded, and figure out where the outlaws are going next. They won't give up after one setback. We need to stay ahead of them." Cole nodded, his expression unreadable. I've got some contacts who might know where they're hiding. I can find out. Jack didn't want to rely on Cole, but he couldn't deny the offer. Fine, but we need real information, not just rumors. This town doesn't need any more half-baked promises. Cole gave a sharp nod, his eyes hardening. Understood. I'll get you something solid. As he turned to leave, Jack couldn't help but feel a sense of unease. Cole's words were always smooth, his confidence unshakable. But Jack knew better than to trust someone who always had a hidden agenda. As the morning dragged on, the town began to regroup. People moved quietly, some tending to the wounded, others helping with the repairs. It was a strange sort of peace, the calm after the storm, but the unease lingered. Everyone knew the fight wasn't over. Jack sat on the porch of the gas station, watching as the workers moved through the wreckage. Samantha came over and sat down beside him, her camera resting on her lap. "You seem distant," she said, her voice quieter than usual. "Something on your mind?" Jack shrugged. "I'm just thinking about what comes next." Samantha nodded, her eyes on the town. "I get it. This place feels like it's on the brink of something big. It's hard to shake the feeling that whatever happens next, it's going to change everything." Jack turned his gaze to her, studying her face. "That's exactly it. It's not just about surviving anymore. It's about winning. And winning means making choices I'm not sure I can live with." Samantha didn't speak for a moment, but when she did, her words were unexpected. Sometimes the right choice isn't the easiest one, but it's the one that gets you where you need to go. Jack considered her words. "Yeah, maybe." The sound of an approaching vehicle broke their quiet conversation. Jack's attention snapped toward it, recognizing the familiar truck that Cole had driven into town. He was back, and this time, he had something. Cole stepped out of the truck with a grim look on his face. He didn't even glance at Jack or Roy before walking straight to the group. "I've got news," he said, his voice low. Jack stood up, his hand instinctively reaching for the gun at his side. "What's the word?" Cole paused, his eyes shifting between the group. "The outlaws are holed up about 20 miles east of here, in a compound just off the highway. They're waiting for reinforcements." Roy's face darkened. "Reinforcements? From where?" Cole shook his head. "I don't know, but they've got the numbers. They'll be coming with everything they've got." Jack felt his stomach tighten. This was worse than he'd expected. The outlaws were preparing for something big, and the town was right in their sights. "Do you have a plan?" Roy asked, his tone sharp. Cole didn't respond right away. Instead, he looked directly at Jack. "You're going to need more than just a fight to take them down. You'll need allies, and you'll need to get them fast." Jack's eyes narrowed. "You suggesting we ask for help?" Cole's expression remained unreadable. "You're going to need it. Trust me on that." The weight of the situation hit Jack like a ton of bricks. He had hoped that the fight would end here, that they could hold the line. But now, he knew the truth. The war was just beginning, and if they didn't find a way to win this time, they might lose everything. The town had always been a place of quiet solitude, a simple stop on the highway where people could fuel up and move on. Now, it had become a battleground, and Jack could feel the weight of that transformation pressing down on him. The outlaws weren't just a gang anymore. They were a force to be reckoned with, and they had their sights set on this town. Jack knew that Cole was right. He couldn't take on the outlaws alone. Even with the townspeople rallying behind him, they were vastly outnumbered, and the resources were slim. They needed help, and they needed it fast. The question, though, was where to find allies in a town this small. Jack had some ideas, but none of them were easy or safe. "Roy," Jack said, his voice low, "we need to talk about bringing in some outside help." Roy raised an eyebrow. "Outside help? You mean like Cole's contacts?" Jack nodded. "Exactly. But we need to be careful who we trust. The last thing we need is someone who'll sell us out." Roy crossed his arms, his face grim. "You think Cole's playing us?" Jack looked out at the horizon, the sun beginning to dip lower in the sky. "I'm not sure, but I don't have many options right now. We're desperate." Roy didn't respond immediately, his eyes scanning the distance. After a moment, he spoke again. "We've got a few folks we could reach out to. Some old military contacts. They owe me a favor or two. Jack felt a glimmer of hope at that. Military contacts would be invaluable, but it was risky. They'd be pulling in outsiders, people who didn't know the land or the stakes as intimately as they did. The balance between survival and betrayal was thin, and Jack wasn't willing to let the wrong people into the fold. "Let's do it," Jack said, his tone firm. "But we move quickly. I don't know how much time we have before the outlaws come at us full force." As Jack prepared to send out the word to his military contacts, he found himself sitting on the porch again, looking out at the horizon. Samantha had been quiet for the last few hours, her camera still by her side. She wasn't the type to dwell on emotions, but there was something different in the air, something heavy that seemed to weigh on her, too. "You're thinking about it too much," she said suddenly, breaking the silence. Jack turned to face her, his eyes tired. "Thinking about what?" "About the people you're about to bring in," she replied, her voice soft but steady. "You're wondering if they'll help, or if they'll turn on you. It's understandable." Jack exhaled sharply. "I don't have a choice, Sam. If we don't get reinforcements, we're dead in the water." "I know," she said, "but that's not the whole story, is it? You're not just trying to survive anymore. You're trying to protect something. These people, this town, everything that's been built here. And that means making decisions that might not always feel good, but you'll do it anyway." Jack considered her words, the truth of them sinking in. "You're right, but that doesn't make it any easier." Samantha looked at him, her expression thoughtful. "No, it doesn't. But maybe that's the point. Sometimes it's not about making the easy choice. It's about doing what needs to be done, even if it costs you." Jack nodded, her words echoing in his mind. He'd been thinking a lot about what it would cost to win, but he hadn't fully considered what it would cost to lose. Not just in terms of lives, but in everything. "I won't let them take this town," Jack said, his voice hardening with resolve. Samantha gave him a small, almost imperceptible nod. "I know, and that's what makes you dangerous." Later that evening, Jack, Roy, and Cole met in the dimly lit backroom of the gas station, the only place left in town that still felt somewhat secure. The rest of the town had settled into uneasy silence, preparing for what might come next, but Jack couldn't shake the feeling that they were running out of time. "So, what's the word?" Roy asked, leaning forward, his eyes sharp. Cole sat across from them, his posture relaxed but his eyes calculating. "I've made contact with a few people," he said, leaning forward as well. "A few soldiers who can get you what you need. They'll be here within the next 24 hours. Jack looked at him, skepticism clear in his gaze. "You're sure about this?" Cole's lips curled into a tight smile. "As sure as I can be. These guys owe me. They won't back out." Roy raised an eyebrow. "If they do, we'll be in the shit. You know that, right?" Cole didn't flinch. "I'm not the one who's about to put your town at risk, but if you want to fight back, you'll need numbers. And they'll give you that." Jack stood up, his hands clenched at his sides. "Then we take the fight to them. No waiting, no more stalling. We hit them before they get their reinforcements." Cole nodded, his expression unreadable. "You're going to need a strategy. It's not going to be a walk in the park." "We're not looking for a walk in the park," Jack replied, his voice colder than before. "We're looking for a way to survive. And if we don't hit them now, we won't get another chance." As the night descended upon the town, Jack stood on the edge of the gas station, looking out into the blackened distance. He could feel the storm brewing, the weight of what was coming pressing on his chest. The plan was in motion, the reinforcements on their way. But even with that, Jack couldn't shake the feeling that it might not be enough. He wasn't just fighting for survival anymore. He was fighting for the very soul of the town. And with each step he took, the ground beneath him seemed to tremble with the uncertainty of what would come next. In the distance, the sound of engines rumbled faintly, a reminder of the chaos just beyond their borders. Jack's hand rested on the holster of his gun, his mind focused on the battle ahead. There would be no turning back now. The next day came with an eerie silence. The sun was barely up, casting long shadows over the town, but the usual hum of life was gone. People were still awake, of course, alert and on edge, but the morning light felt too bright for the heavy atmosphere that loomed. Jack could feel the weight of what was coming, and it pressed on his chest like a boulder. It was mid-morning when the first of Cole's military contacts arrived. A convoy of black trucks rumbled down the dirt road, engines roaring like thunder as they approached the gas station. Jack stood at the entrance, waiting. His heart thudded in his chest, his hand tight on the grip of his sidearm. The moment the convoy arrived, he knew there would be no going back. The trucks came to a stop, and the doors opened. Out stepped a handful of men, their faces hard and unreadable, clad in military gear. They were well-trained, their movements precise, their eyes scanning the area as if they had done this 100 times before. Jack felt a sense of unease in his gut. "Jack," Cole said from behind him, his voice low. "These guys are good. You'll be fine." Jack didn't respond immediately, his gaze fixed on the newcomers. He had no doubt about their skill, but the question still gnawed at him. Could he trust them? A man who looked to be in charge approached him. He was tall, broad-shouldered, and his face was scarred, but his eyes were sharp, calculating. "You Jack?" he asked, his voice thick with authority. Jack nodded. "That's me." The man extended a hand, and Jack took it firmly. "I'm Sergeant Matthews. Cole called us in. We're here to help you deal with the outlaws." Jack studied him for a moment before speaking. "You sure your people can handle this? We've got more than just a gang to worry about." Matthews smirked, though there was no humor in it. "This isn't our first rodeo. We've dealt with worse. What you're up against, we can handle." Jack felt a flicker of relief at that, but it was fleeting. He knew that confidence meant nothing if they couldn't get the job done. "All right," Jack said, stepping aside. "Let's get to work." The planning session was intense. Jack, Roy, Matthews, and the rest of the reinforcements gathered in the back room of the gas station. A large map was spread out on the table, marking the position of the outlaws' compound and key points of the town. Jack leaned over it, tracing the lines with his finger. "They've got the high ground," Matthews said, pointing to the map. "We'll have to move fast and hit them before they can get their reinforcements in place." Roy nodded, his face tight. "We can't afford to wait. The longer we sit on our hands, the worse it gets." Jack agreed, his mind already racing through the possible outcomes. "We'll send in a small team to hit their supply lines, cause as much damage as we can, and draw them out. The rest of US will hold the line here and make sure they don't come charging in from the back." Matthews eyed Jack carefully. "You sure you want to split the forces like that? We're already outnumbered." Jack looked up from the map, meeting Matthews' gaze. "We're outgunned too. The only way we're going to survive is if we hit them hard and fast, take them by surprise. If we wait around, we'll be dead in the water." Matthews seemed to think it over for a moment before nodding. "All right, we'll follow your lead. But I'm not making any promises on how clean this is going to be." Jack couldn't make any promises either. He just knew they had to try. As the day wore on, the preparations continued. Everyone worked quietly but efficiently, knowing that soon, they would be engaged in the most important fight of their lives. Jack could feel the tension rising, the air thick with the anticipation of what was to come. The town, for all its strength, was fragile. They had managed to fight off the outlaws once, but this time would be different. Jack found himself standing on the porch again, looking out at the horizon, where the sun was now dipping low, casting long shadows over the land. His thoughts were a jumble, thoughts of survival, of the people who depended on him, and of what it would mean to win or lose this fight. Samantha came up beside him, her camera hanging loosely from her neck. She didn't speak at first, but Jack could feel her presence beside him, steady and quiet. "This is it, isn't it?" she asked softly, breaking the silence. Jack didn't look at her, but he could hear the uncertainty in her voice. "Yeah," he said. "This is it." For a moment, they stood in silence, watching the last remnants of daylight fade. "I've seen a lot of things in my life," Samantha said, her voice distant, "but nothing like this." Jack glanced at her then, his eyes softening. "I know. I never thought I'd be standing here, either. But we don't have a choice. We fight, or we die." Samantha nodded, though her face remained uncertain. "What if we don't make it?" Jack's heart clenched, but he didn't let the thought linger. "We will. We have to." She turned to him then, her expression serious. "What if it costs you everything? Your people, Your town. Your life. Are you ready for that? Jack felt the weight of her words settle deep inside him. Was he ready for that? Could anyone ever be truly ready? I don't know, he said finally, but I can't just stand by and let them take everything. We've got to make a stand. For everyone who's ever called this place home. Samantha didn't respond right away, but Jack saw the faintest glimmer of understanding in her eyes. She was with him. Whatever happened, she was in this fight too. As the night began to fall, Jack gathered his team. Matthew's reinforcements were ready, and the time had come. The outlaws would soon know the meaning of resistance. We hit them hard and fast, Jack said, his voice calm but carrying the weight of a leader. No hesitation. We keep them off balance, and we make sure they don't know what hit them. Roy gave a sharp nod, his face determined. Let's make it count. As they moved into position, Jack's thoughts briefly flickered back to the quiet moments of the day, the calm before the storm. He didn't know what the outcome would be, but he had made peace with the fact that this was the only option left. They had no choice but to fight. The first shot rang out in the distance, a harbinger of the chaos that was about to unfold. And then it was on. The air was thick with tension as the first shot echoed across the desolate land. The sound cut through the night like a thunderclap, signaling the beginning of the end. Jack's heart pounded in his chest as he led the charge, his mind focused on the task ahead. Every muscle in his body was coiled, ready for the battle that would determine the fate of the town and his own survival. The outlaws hadn't expected the attack to come so soon. They had been preparing for something bigger, but not a full-scale assault in the dead of night. Jack and his team had managed to get close enough to their perimeter to launch the first wave of attacks. The plan was simple: create chaos, disrupt their communications, sabotage their vehicles, and force them to scatter. It was a gamble, but Jack had never been the type to sit back and wait for the enemy to make the first move. Move fast, hit hard, Jack said, his voice tight with urgency. Keep them on their toes. We can't let them get organized. The first explosion went off near one of the outlaws' supply trucks. The flash of light was blinding, followed by the deafening sound of metal and machinery tearing apart. Jack's men had placed explosives in strategic positions, just enough to create confusion and chaos. It worked. Screams and shouts filled the air as the outlaws scrambled to respond. They were disoriented, their carefully structured defenses beginning to unravel. Jack didn't give them a chance to recover. He and his team pressed forward, moving quickly through the shadows, striking from unexpected angles. Every step was a gamble. They knew the risks. But as Jack watched the chaos unfold, a strange sense of exhilaration washed over him. This was what he had been waiting for, the fight he couldn't avoid anymore. But as quickly as the outlaws stumbled, they regrouped. They were far from unprepared, and their counterattack came swift and brutal. Fall back, Matthews shouted into the comms as gunfire erupted in all directions. The once peaceful town was now a war zone. The outlaws, despite their disarray, were organized. They had been in battles like this before, and it showed. They fought back with a ferocity that matched the intensity of Jack's assault. Jack's heart raced as he saw one of his men go down, a bullet tearing through his chest. The man didn't scream, didn't have time. His body crumpled to the ground with a sickening thud. "Cover fire," Jack shouted, his voice hoarse as he crouched behind an overturned vehicle, his gun raised. They couldn't afford to lose more men. Not now. Samantha, who had stayed close behind Jack to capture footage, was nowhere to be seen. Jack's stomach twisted as he scanned the battlefield, his eyes narrowing with growing panic. He couldn't let her get caught in the crossfire. A few feet away, Roy and Matthews were moving with purpose, directing the troops, coordinating the retreat while still fending off incoming fire. Jack knew he couldn't stay in one spot for long. They had to move, and fast. The minutes stretched into what felt like hours. The battle had escalated far beyond what Jack had imagined. The outlaws weren't backing down, and neither was Jack. They pushed, they fought, they bled, but they wouldn't give up. "We need to take out their command post," Roy shouted, his voice full of urgency. "It's the only way we'll stop this before it gets worse." Jack nodded, his eyes scanning the distance. The command post was situated near the center of the outlaws' encampment. It was heavily guarded, but it was their only chance at regaining control of the situation. "On me," Jack ordered, signaling his team to follow. They moved quickly, ducking behind structures for cover, making their way toward the heart of the enemy's stronghold. As they got closer, Jack could hear the frantic chatter of the outlaws' communications. It was a constant hum of voices, trying to coordinate the defense, but it was clear they were starting to falter. Jack knew this was their opening. They reached the outskirts of the command post without incident, but that's when the real danger set in. The outlaws had posted lookouts, men armed with rifles who had the advantage of elevation. As Jack and his team moved into position, they were spotted. The gunfire was instantaneous. Bullets whizzed by, narrowly missing Jack's team as they scrambled for cover. But they had no choice now. The command post had to fall. "Go!" Jack shouted, signaling to his team to advance. They charged forward, weapons blazing, pushing through the hail of bullets. Jack's heart was in his throat as he darted from cover to cover, adrenaline coursing through his veins. Just when it seemed like they were about to be overwhelmed, a sudden explosion rocked the battlefield. Jack's ears rang as the earth beneath him shook. A nearby structure, one of the outlaws' supply buildings, had gone up in flames. For a moment, the outlaws hesitated. It was a small opening, but it was enough. Jack and his team seized the moment, pushing through the last line of defense and crashing into the command post. The command post fell faster than Jack had hoped. With the main leadership gone, the outlaws lost their cohesion. Jack's men fought fiercely, taking down the remaining scattered enemies with precision. But the victory came at a cost. The battle had been brutal, and many had fallen. Jack stood amidst the wreckage, panting, blood staining his clothes, his body aching. His mind was numb from the chaos of it all. He took a deep breath, his eyes scanning the battlefield for Samantha. And then, as if on cue, she appeared from behind a nearby structure, her camera still hanging around her neck, her face dirted and scratched but alive. Jack's heart skipped a beat, and a brief sense of relief washed over him. "I thought I lost you," Jack said, his voice shaky with emotion. Samantha gave him a small smile, though it didn't reach her eyes. "I'm still here." Jack stepped closer, his hand instinctively reaching out to touch her arm. "We've won. We've taken them down." She nodded, though the weight of the words seemed to hang heavy between them. "For now, Jack. For now." And even as the sound of distant sirens began to grow louder, reinforcements from nearby towns arriving to help with the aftermath, Jack couldn't shake the feeling that this fight was far from over. The outlaws had been dealt a blow, but there were still questions unanswered, and dangers lurking just beyond the horizon. This battle was just the beginning. The night after the battle felt like a strange dream, too quiet, too surreal. The sun was rising over the charred remains of what had once been the outlaws' camp, but the town was far from peaceful. The cost of the victory was already becoming clear. There were bodies to bury, injuries to tend to, and the looming question of what would happen next. Jack stood at the edge of the makeshift graveyard, watching as the last of the fallen soldiers were laid to rest. His stomach twisted at the sight. Men and women who had fought beside him, who had believed in the cause, now gone. They were buried with respect, each of them honored for their bravery. Yet, Jack couldn't shake the feeling that this was far from the end of the road. The victory they had earned felt hollow in the face of so much loss. As he turned away from the graves, Roy came up beside him, his face grim. "We did what we had to do, but this doesn't feel like winning, does it?" Jack shook his head slowly. "No, it doesn't. We lost too much. Too many good people." Roy clapped a hand on his shoulder. "We can't undo it, but we can make sure it wasn't for nothing." Jack nodded, though the weight of his thoughts didn't lift. The outlaws might have been decimated for now, but Jack knew better than anyone that peace was fleeting. The world was unpredictable, and the next storm could be right around the corner. Samantha had been on the front lines with her camera, capturing the brutal realities of the battle. After the dust settled, she had to process the footage. The images were raw, blood, death, destruction. But there was also something else in the frames. Something more difficult to capture, the human cost of war. The faces of the survivors, the fear and relief, the anger and the sorrow. Sitting on a crate in the corner of the gas station, Samantha scrolled through the images on her camera. Her fingers trembled, not from the cold, but from the weight of what she had witnessed. She had been a journalist for years, but nothing had prepared her for this. It was one thing to report on distant wars, and another to be standing in the midst of one. To see the faces of people she had come to know, to hear their final words, to watch them fight until the very end. A knock on the door broke her from her reverie. She looked up, expecting it to be Jack, but it was Cole. "You all right?" he asked, his voice soft but carrying a sense of authority. Samantha nodded slowly, not trusting herself to speak. She hadn't realized how much she needed someone to talk to until now. "It's just hard, you know? Seeing it all. I've covered stories before, but this, it's different." Cole leaned against the doorframe, arms crossed. "I get it. It's a lot. But you're doing what you were meant to do. People need to know what happened here. The world needs to see the truth." Samantha's eyes flickered back to the screen of her camera. "I just wish it didn't have to be this way. So much destruction, and for what?" "For survival," Cole said with a heavy sigh. "Sometimes that's all there is." As the days passed, the survivors of the battle began to rebuild. The town was a mess, windows shattered, buildings burned, the gas station itself still smoldering from the aftermath. But even in the midst of it all, there was a sense of purpose. The people of the town didn't have the luxury of grief for too long. They had to pull together, because the world was never going to stop coming for them. Jack spent long hours with his people, ensuring the wounded were cared for, making plans for the future. It was strange to think about rebuilding after such devastation, but Jack knew they couldn't let the fear of what had happened paralyze them. They had to keep moving forward. Samantha, meanwhile, continued documenting everything. She knew her role had changed. She wasn't just a journalist anymore. She was a witness. Her footage, her photos, they would tell the story of what had happened in this small town. The world would know the price of survival. Though the outlaws had been scattered, Jack knew they weren't truly gone. They had been fractured, but there were too many factions in the world for them to disappear entirely. Other groups would rise in their place, and the threat would never truly go away. That night, Jack gathered his remaining allies, Cole, Roy, Matthews, and a few trusted locals, around a table at the gas station. The mood was somber, the glow of a few lanterns casting shadows on their faces. "We've done what we could," Jack started, his voice steady but tired. "But the war's not over. The outlaws were just one part of a much bigger problem. If we're going to survive, we need to be ready for whatever comes next." Roy spoke up, his voice thick with determination. "We're not going to let them take our town. Not after what we've been through." Matthews nodded. "We'll fortify the perimeter. We've got enough weapons to hold our ground. If anyone else tries to take a shot at us, they'll regret it." "But we're not just fighting for this town anymore," Jack said, his gaze sweeping across the table. "We're fighting for the people who can't fight for themselves. We have to keep moving forward, no matter what." Samantha, who had quietly been observing, spoke up for the first time. "What if this is just the beginning? What if there are others out there just like the outlaws, ready to sweep through and destroy everything you've worked for?" Jack looked at her, his expression unreadable. "Then we'll be ready." Despite everything, there was a strange sense of hope that began to settle over the survivors. It wasn't the kind of hope that comes from believing everything would be all right, because Jack knew that wasn't true. But it was the kind of hope that came from standing together, fighting for something worth saving. The town had endured, and so had they. The gas station, once a symbol of chaos and death, began to take on a new meaning. It was a place of refuge now, a place where they could rebuild. The sun was setting again, casting a golden glow over the horizon. Jack stood outside, watching as the last rays of daylight slipped behind the distant hills. Samantha came up beside him, her camera now hanging loosely at her side. She looked at him, her eyes soft but steady. "You're still here," she said quietly. Jack gave a small, weary smile. "For now, and as long as I'm here, I'll fight for this town." And with that, they stood in silence, watching the world continue on, the uncertainty of the future hanging just out of reach but still very much present. For now, they had survived. But Jack knew they couldn't afford to relax. The road ahead was long, and they were just getting started. In the days following the battle, the town seemed to settle into an eerie calm. The smoke from the wreckage had long since dissipated, and the streets, once filled with the sounds of gunfire and chaos, now echoed with the mundane hum of life trying to return to normal. But for Jack and the others, the calm was unsettling. It felt like the silence before a storm, uncomfortably still, as if the world was holding its breath. The survivors were working tirelessly, not just to rebuild homes and businesses, but to restore a sense of safety and stability to their community. Jack had been in touch with other towns nearby, coordinating efforts to secure food, medical supplies, and weapons. But resources were limited, and the reality of their situation was starting to sink in. Cole had taken charge of organizing the defense. The perimeter around the town was being reinforced, and lookouts were posted at key points, watching for any sign of trouble. The walls of the town were slowly being strengthened, and there was talk of fortifying the gas station, turning it into a proper stronghold. But no one was under any illusion. They were far from safe. Roy, ever the optimist, tried to keep morale up. "We've weathered the worst of it," he said one evening, trying to rally the others as they worked. "Now, we rebuild. We do it together. We're stronger now." But Jack wasn't so sure. He couldn't shake the feeling that they were only buying time. The outlaws may have been broken, but there were other threats out there. Other groups that were just as dangerous, if not more so. And as the days passed, Jack's unease only grew. Samantha had been spending most of her time documenting the rebuilding process. Her camera had become more than just a tool. It was her way of making sense of everything that had happened. She took pictures of the people working, the quiet moments between survivors, the way the sun seemed to shine a little brighter over the charred remains of the town. She took pictures of everything, trying to capture a sense of hope amid the devastation. But even she couldn't deny the tension that still hung in the air. Everyone was trying to move on, but there was a lingering fear. A fear that the worst was far from over. She couldn't shake the feeling that something else was coming, something they weren't prepared for. One evening, after a long day of filming, Samantha found herself sitting on the porch of the gas station, watching the sun dip below the horizon. Jack joined her a few minutes later, his silhouette dark against the fading light. "You think we'll make it?" she asked quietly, not looking at him. Jack sat down beside her, his eyes scanning the distant hills. "I hope so," he said, his voice low. "But hoping isn't enough. We need to stay vigilant. We can't afford to let our guard down, not for a second." Samantha nodded, though she didn't fully understand the weight of his words. She was a journalist, not a fighter. She didn't know what it felt like to have everything you loved on the line, to have your entire life hinge on a single battle. But she knew Jack had seen things that had changed him, made him harder, more determined. He wasn't going to let anything happen to the town, and neither was she. 2 days later, Jack was jolted from his restless thoughts when a familiar face appeared in the town. It was a figure from his past, someone he hadn't seen in years. Tom Harris, an old friend from his time in the military. Tom was tall, with the same stoic demeanor Jack remembered, though the years had clearly taken their toll. He carried himself with a military precision, his eyes scanning the area as though he were already analyzing potential threats. "Jack," Tom greeted him, his voice firm but friendly. "Been a while, huh?" Jack didn't respond right away, his mind racing. Tom had left the service years ago, and Jack hadn't heard from him since. To see him here, at this moment, was both a welcome surprise and a cause for concern. "Tom," Jack said finally, offering a handshake, "what brings you here?" Tom's gaze shifted to the remnants of the town behind them. "I've heard what's been happening out here," he said, his voice laced with concern. "I've got a team with me. We've been scouting the area. Thought you might need some extra help." Jack studied him for a moment, trying to gauge the sincerity in his voice. "Help? From who?" Tom glanced over his shoulder, where a handful of soldiers in tactical gear were waiting. "From people who know how to handle situations like this. I've got men and women who've been in the field for years. We've got resources, training, and intel. You're not the only ones worried about the outlaws. In the bigger picture." Jack's stomach tightened. He knew this moment had been coming, but he hadn't expected it to come so soon. There were others out there, people with power and influence, and they were starting to notice what was happening here. That could mean good things for the town, but it could also mean that they were about to be drawn into something much larger than they could handle. After a brief meeting with Tom and his team, Jack sat down with Roy and Matthews to discuss the offer. The prospect of reinforcements was tempting. Tom's group had weapons, military-grade equipment, and experience. They could help shore up the town's defenses, provide training, and give them a fighting chance if another battle came their way. But Jack wasn't sure it was a good idea to trust these new allies just yet. "We don't know anything about these people," Matthews said, his voice edged with suspicion. "Just because they've got weapons and experience doesn't mean we can trust them." "I know Tom," Jack replied. "He's not the type to stab you in the back. But this is bigger than what we can handle on our own. We need their help." Roy leaned forward. "What's the catch, Jack?" "There's always a catch. You know that as well as I do." Jack exhaled slowly. "I'm not sure yet, but if we don't take the offer, we're vulnerable. We can't afford to let our guard down." They all fell silent, the weight of Jack's words hanging heavily in the air. The decision wasn't an easy one, but Jack knew that if they were going to survive what was coming, they needed every advantage they could get. And if that meant accepting help from Tom and his team, then so be it. But deep down, Jack couldn't shake the feeling that this new alliance would bring more trouble than he bargained for. The town moved forward with the addition of Tom and his team, but the uneasy feeling that had settled over Jack remained. They were preparing for something, preparing for the inevitable. The war wasn't over. And as the sun set on another quiet day, Jack couldn't help but wonder what lay ahead. The quiet was just a lull. The next storm was already on its way. The town of Hope Springs had settled into a tentative rhythm, a fragile peace that was as fleeting as it was necessary. The new arrivals, Tom and his team, had integrated quickly into the community, helping to fortify the defenses, provide training, and, most importantly, offer a sense of security. Jack wasn't entirely at ease with the situation, but he knew that any form of strength was a step in the right direction. They were rebuilding, surviving, but in the back of his mind, a storm was brewing, and Jack could feel it. The presence of Tom and his team, while an undeniable boost, had caused ripples of discomfort throughout the town. Some were grateful for the extra help, while others were skeptical. The town had fought hard for its independence, and the idea of outsiders, especially people with military experience, coming in and taking control, even temporarily, was unsettling. Some residents voiced their concerns quietly. Others, like Roy, tried to keep morale high by emphasizing the necessity of the help. As Jack walked through the town one afternoon, he noticed the uneasy glances being exchanged among the townsfolk. The tension was palpable. The people of Hope Springs had fought for their survival without the help of outsiders, and they were proud of it. Now, they were facing the reality that the world outside their town was much larger and more dangerous than they'd ever imagined. And if Tom's team was the first of many groups looking to stake their claim, things could get complicated. Samantha, ever the observer, had her camera in hand as she wandered through the streets, documenting the changes. While the town was physically rebuilding, the emotional landscape was shifting too. The people were wary, trying to adjust to the presence of the newcomers, but there was also a strange sense of unity. They had survived the outlaws together. Could they survive the encroaching forces threatening their home? Samantha wasn't sure, but the uncertainty was what made her job as a journalist all the more critical. She found herself drawn to Jack one afternoon as he stood by the perimeter with Tom, discussing strategies for reinforcing the town's defenses. The town had never been built to withstand an organized attack, and Tom's group brought with them resources that Hope Springs didn't have. While Samantha had grown used to the quiet strength of Jack's leadership, there was something different in his demeanor today. He looked tired, tired of being in charge, tired of the constant fight. Samantha approached him cautiously, as though sensing the weight of his thoughts. "You all right?" she asked, trying to break through the tension. Jack glanced at her, offering a half-smile. "Yeah, just wondering what comes next." She raised an eyebrow. "You think there's another fight coming?" "I know it," he said, his voice steady but filled with an underlying tension. "The world doesn't just forget. The outlaws might be gone, but there are others out there. And I can't afford to let my guard down, not with everything we've built here." Samantha looked out at the horizon, her gaze distant. I just hope we're ready for whatever comes. We don't have the luxury of being complacent. Jack gave a small nod. We'll be ready. We have to be. The unsettling feeling that had lingered in Jack's chest for days finally manifested when one of the town's scouts, a young man named Jake, returned from a reconnaissance mission. His face was pale, and there was a grim look in his eyes that immediately put everyone on edge. Jack, Jake called out as he approached, we've got a problem. Jack met him halfway, his instincts immediately kicking in. What's going on? Jake's voice dropped to a whisper. It's the Sons of Liberty. They're making their way down from the north. The words hit Jack like a punch to the gut. The Sons of Liberty were notorious for their ruthless tactics, a militant group with a history of taking control of territory through intimidation and violence. They were well-organized and well-armed, far more dangerous than the outlaws. Jack's mind raced. How many? He asked, though he already knew the answer. At least 50, maybe more, Jake replied. And they're armed to the teeth. They've been raiding smaller towns up north for months. It's only a matter of time before they get here. Jack felt his stomach drop. The Sons of Liberty were a much larger threat than the outlaws had ever been. Their presence meant that Hope Springs was about to be drawn into something much bigger than a local struggle. That evening, Jack called an emergency meeting with Roy, Matthews, Tom, and the other town leaders. They gathered in the gas station, the air thick with tension. Everyone knew what was coming, but the question was, how would they respond? We can't let them take our town, Roy said, his voice resolute. We fought too hard to let someone else just roll in and take it from us. Tom spoke up, his military experience evident in his tone. We need to prepare. They're not going to be content with just raiding. They're looking for a foothold. If they get here, it's not just about fighting them off. It's about stopping a larger conflict from swallowing this entire region. Matthews, ever the pragmatist, looked at Jack. You know what this means, don't you? If we stand up to them, we're declaring war. And if we back down, we're giving them an opening to take control. Jack rubbed his forehead, feeling the weight of the decision pressing down on him. We can't afford to back down. Not now. But we can't do this alone. We need every able-bodied person in this town ready to fight. And we need to secure outside help. Tom, can your team handle the Sons of Liberty? Tom nodded, his expression hard. We've dealt with groups like them before, but we'll need reinforcements. And we'll need to move fast. The council fell silent as everyone processed the gravity of the situation. It wasn't just about defending a town anymore. It was about protecting their future. Jack didn't waste any time. The very next day, he reached out to other towns in the region, sending out calls for help. He knew that without reinforcements, Hope Springs stood no chance against the Sons of Liberty. The message was clear: band together or risk losing everything. As the hours passed, Jack couldn't help but feel the weight of leadership pressing on him. His decisions weren't just about the survival of Hope Springs. They were about the survival of everyone in the surrounding areas. If they failed, it wouldn't just be Hope Springs that fell. It would be the beginning of a domino effect. As the sun began to set, Jack stood alone at the edge of the town, looking out toward the north. The horizon was dark, and a sense of impending doom settled over him. The storm was coming, and this time, they might not be able to survive it. The town of Hope Springs had always been a small, quiet place. One where the biggest concerns had once been keeping the gas station stocked and dealing with the occasional squabble over land rights. But that was before the outlaws had come. And now, with the Sons of Liberty approaching, the stakes were higher than ever. The morning after Jack's call for reinforcements, the atmosphere in Hope Springs was thick with anticipation. The people who had once been just survivors were now preparing for war. For some, the weight of the situation was too much. There were whispered conversations in the streets, nervous eyes glancing over their shoulders, unsure of what would come next. But for Jack, there was no room for doubt. The enemy was on their doorstep, and there was only one thing to do: stand and fight. The first wave of reinforcements had arrived late last night, a mix of armed civilians, militia fighters, and a few seasoned veterans from nearby towns. They were a ragtag group, but they came with determination. Jack had briefed them quickly, giving orders and organizing defenses. Their numbers weren't huge, but it was enough to create a semblance of a fighting force. By morning, the town was buzzing with activity. Men and women, both young and old, worked together, fortifying buildings, piling up supplies, and setting up positions along the perimeter. The gas station, now a central point of defense, had been turned into a stronghold. Sandbags were stacked high, and makeshift barriers were erected. Everyone was armed, some with weapons they had scavenged, others with tools that could be used as weapons. There was no room for hesitation. Samantha had been documenting the preparations with her camera, capturing the quiet resolve in the faces of the townspeople. But there was no denying the fear in their eyes. She could feel it too, the tension, the weight of what was about to happen. This was no longer about survival. This was about standing their ground, no matter the cost. She found herself alongside Jack again, as they stood near the newly reinforced gate, watching as the defenders took their positions. "How do you feel?" she asked, her voice breaking the silence. Jack glanced over at her, his face as stoic as ever. "Like we're about to face something worse than we've ever known." He didn't say it out loud, but Samantha knew that the fear in his eyes wasn't just for the town. It was for the people, the children, the families who had trusted him to keep them safe. It was the burden of leadership that weighed most heavily on him. It wasn't long before the first signs of the Sons of Liberty's arrival appeared on the horizon. A dark cloud of dust, swirling behind them, signaled their approach. They were not subtle. Armored vehicles rumbled across the plains, their engines roaring with a menacing power. At the forefront of the convoy were dozens of heavily armed fighters, riding motorcycles and jeeps, their faces hidden behind masks and helmets. They were a force to be reckoned with, and it was clear they intended to take Hope Springs. Jack's heart pounded as he watched the approaching convoy. He had faced threats before, but this was different. The Sons of Liberty weren't just raiders. They were a military force, a well-organized army with the experience and resources to overwhelm a small town. "Here they come," Roy said, his voice steady but edged with concern. "Time to put everything we've got into play." The Sons of Liberty didn't waste time. As soon as they reached the outskirts of the town, they launched their first attack. Heavily armed gunmen advanced, firing sporadically as they sought cover behind abandoned cars and buildings. Jack's defenders opened fire in return, their rifles cracking through the silence as they returned the assault. The battle was chaotic from the start. Explosions rang out as grenades and homemade bombs were thrown, sending debris flying through the air. The air was thick with the smell of smoke and the sound of gunfire, and Jack found himself instinctively moving between the positions, offering orders and encouragement where needed. "Hold your ground," he shouted to the defenders. "Don't let them push forward. We fight together, or we fall apart." Roy, Matthews, and Tom's team were scattered throughout the defense lines, coordinating fire and responding to threats as they emerged. Every position was crucial, and there was no room for error. Samantha had taken up a position behind the gas station, trying to stay out of harm's way, but she couldn't help but feel the pull of the action. She wasn't a fighter, but this was her home, her community. She was going to see this through, no matter what. Just as they began to feel the tide of the battle shift in their favor, the Sons of Liberty pulled back and regrouped, only to return with a stronger force. They had been probing the defenses, testing for weak points, and now they were ready to make a more concentrated push. Jack's heart sank as he saw them move into position, their vehicles lining up along the street. A loud roar erupted from the enemy's side as a large truck, armored and bristling with weapons, charged toward the gas station's main entrance. It was a battering ram, a siege weapon designed to break through defenses. The defenders opened fire, but the truck's armor was thick, and it kept coming. Jack watched in horror as it barreled forward, gaining speed. "We can't hold them off much longer," Matthews shouted over the noise of the gunfire. "We need to fall back to the second line of defense." But it was too late. The truck smashed into the front gates, sending a shockwave through the air. The defenders closest to the gate were thrown to the ground, dazed by the impact. The Sons of Liberty poured through the breach, moving quickly to take control of the gas station. In the chaos of the breach, Jack knew they were out of time. They couldn't afford to let the Sons of Liberty seize control of the gas station. Not only would they lose a critical stronghold, but the enemy would have access to their supplies, their weapons, and their last line of defense. "Fall back," Get to the secondary positions, Jack yelled, but the sound of gunfire drowned out his words. Tom and his team were already moving to take up positions in the rear, while Roy and Matthews coordinated the retreat, directing the civilians to safer areas. Jack stayed behind for just a moment longer, watching the chaos unfold. He knew what had to be done. He turned to Samantha, who was still behind the gas station, her camera raised in one hand, her face pale but determined. Get to safety. Now. Samantha hesitated for a moment, then nodded. She wanted to stay, wanted to help, but Jack was right. There was nothing more she could do here. As she turned to run, Jack sprinted toward the front lines, rallying the defenders. His focus was laser-sharp, his mind clear despite the chaos. The Sons of Liberty had breached the first line, but they weren't going to take Hope Springs without a fight. The storm was here, and it was far from over. The town of Hope Springs was no longer a sanctuary. It had become a battleground. Jack's heart raced as he sprinted through the chaos, his mind locked on one singular goal: keep Hope Springs from falling. The Sons of Liberty were ruthless, organized, and relentless. The sound of gunfire and explosions echoed in the air, the stench of burning debris overwhelming. The once peaceful streets of Hope Springs had turned into a war zone, and the future of the town hung by a thread. The Sons of Liberty had breached the gates and were now pushing deeper into the heart of Hope Springs. The gas station, which had served as the town's main line of defense, was being overrun. Its walls, reinforced with sandbags and scrap metal, had already taken a beating, and the truck that had barreled through the entrance had created a gap too wide to defend effectively. The defenders who had once held firm now found themselves scattered, trying to regroup and push back an increasingly overwhelming force. Jack, along with Roy, Tom, and a handful of survivors, had taken a defensive position behind the broken walls of the station. Bullets whizzed past him, leaving the air thick with danger. He could hear the shouts of the Sons of Liberty as they advanced, their confidence growing with every step. "We can't hold them off much longer," Roy yelled, his face streaked with dirt and sweat. He was reloading his rifle, his expression grim. "We need a plan." "Fall back to the secondary positions," Jack ordered, his voice firm. But there was no hiding the uncertainty in his eyes. The secondary positions weren't much stronger. They were a last-ditch effort to slow down the enemy before retreating completely. Hope Springs had been built to survive a small-scale attack, not a full-on assault from a well-armed militia. Tom moved forward, peering around a corner of the gas station, assessing the situation. "They've got armor, tanks, and heavy artillery. This isn't a fight we can win with small arms." Jack's stomach tightened. He had known from the moment the Sons of Liberty appeared that Hope Springs didn't stand a chance in a direct confrontation. But there was one thing they had: the element of surprise. "You're right," Jack said, his voice cold. "We can't win a direct fight, but we can make them pay for every inch." He turned to Matthews, who had been coordinating the rear defenses. "We need to set a trap, something to slow them down long enough to give us a fighting chance." Matthews nodded. "We've got a few explosives left. We can rig the main road leading into town, block them off with a series of detonations. If we time it right, we can create a bottleneck and force them into a kill zone." Jack clenched his fists. The idea was risky, dangerous even. If the timing wasn't perfect, they'd be caught in the blast too. But at this point, they had no choice. "Do it," Jack said, his voice low but filled with resolve. "Get it set up now. I'll keep them busy." Roy looked at him, a mixture of admiration and concern in his eyes. "Are you sure about this?" Jack didn't respond immediately. Instead, he turned to look at the oncoming forces. The Sons of Liberty were moving steadily, advancing through the town like a tidal wave. Jack knew they couldn't stop them in a head-on fight, but if they could draw them into the right position, they might just have a chance. "This is our only shot," Jack said, his eyes steely. "We have to make them regret ever stepping foot in this town." While Matthews and his team set the trap, Jack, Roy, and Tom stayed behind to provide cover. The Sons of Liberty were getting closer, and Jack could feel the tension building in the air. Every moment was critical. If they didn't act fast, the trap wouldn't work, and Hope Springs would fall. Jack fired his rifle, taking out one of the enemy soldiers in the distance. The man collapsed with a grunt, But the Sons of Liberty barely seemed to notice. They were too many. They were too organized. "This is insane," Roy muttered as he reloaded. "We're fighting a whole army with what, a dozen people?" "We fight because we have no other choice," Jack said, his voice unwavering. "And we fight because this town, our town, deserves better than to fall to people like them." Tom nodded grimly, lining up his shot. "We'll make them pay for every inch they take." As the Sons of Liberty closed in on the gas station, Matthews signaled that the trap was ready. The explosives were set along the main road, primed to detonate at the right moment. Jack's heart raced. This was it. He took a deep breath, steadying his nerves, and looked at Roy and Tom. "Get ready." The rumble of the approaching vehicles grew louder. Jack could feel the ground tremble beneath his feet. The truck, still roaring with its engines, was just a few hundred yards away from the gas station. Jack had no idea how much longer they could hold out, but he knew that this was their last chance. And then, it happened. The ground exploded beneath them. A massive blast shook the town as the first set of explosives went off, sending a cloud of dust and debris into the air. The Sons of Liberty's front line was thrown into chaos as the explosion forced them to scatter, confusion rippling through their ranks. The vehicles screeched to a halt, and gunfire erupted as the enemy scrambled to regroup. "Now!" Jack shouted. With the enemy's focus temporarily broken, Jack and his team made their move, firing relentlessly as the Sons of Liberty tried to get their bearings. The battle had shifted in their favor, but the odds were still stacked against them. The trap had created a bottleneck, but it wasn't enough to turn the tide entirely. Not yet. With the enemy in disarray, Jack saw a small opening, a chance to strike at the heart of the enemy's command. Tom, Roy, and Matthews were already moving in sync, a well-oiled team of survivors fighting against overwhelming odds. Jack's mind raced as he scanned the battlefield, his every instinct screaming at him to take action. If they could eliminate the Sons of Liberty's leadership, the rest of the force would likely collapse. "We move now," Jack ordered. The team broke through the chaos, using the debris and the smoke as cover. They moved fast, determined to strike a decisive blow. At the head of the Sons of Liberty's group, a man in dark tactical gear stood, barking orders to his men. He was the leader, and Jack could feel the weight of the moment. This was the man who could end it all. With a sharp nod, Jack signaled for Tom and Roy to take the left flank. They were in position. With a single motion, Jack charged forward, firing his rifle as he closed the distance between himself and the leader. The world seemed to slow as he aimed carefully, his heart pounding in his chest. And then, with a single shot, the Sons of Liberty's leader fell. The remaining fighters hesitated, unsure of their next move. The tide had shifted, and the battle was far from over. But with their leader gone, Jack knew they had a chance to win. The death of the Sons of Liberty's leader did not end the battle, but it shifted the momentum. As the man collapsed, the remaining fighters hesitated, unsure, disorganized. They had no clear direction, no unifying force to lead them forward. The blast from the explosives, the confusion, and the death of their leader had shattered their confidence. The survivors of Hope Springs weren't about to let that moment of doubt slip away. Jack's heart was still pounding as he moved swiftly across the battlefield, his rifle aimed steady and true. The Sons of Liberty fighters, now without leadership, were scattered, their cohesion breaking apart like brittle wood under pressure. It was a disorienting feeling, a mix of hope and fear. "We can win this," Jack muttered under his breath. The thought pushed him forward, through the debris and the smoke, toward the remnants of the enemy force. Roy and Tom were right behind him, each man focused, grim, yet driven by the singular idea that they could still save their town. They lost so much already, too much, but they couldn't lose now. Not after everything. The gas station had been a stronghold, but it was now little more than a shattered ruin. The town was battered, its streets torn apart, but the people of Hope Springs weren't ready to give up. Even the children, hiding in the shelter of buildings, were watching with wide eyes as the fight raged on. They couldn't afford to lose, especially not in front of the next generation. "Jack!" Roy shouted from behind him. Jack didn't turn around. He didn't have time to, but he knew from Roy's tone that something had changed. He kept moving, keeping his eyes on the enemy. The Sons of Liberty were pulling back, retreating under the cover of their scattered vehicles and disrupted lines. But then Jack heard something, the sound of an engine. From around the corner of a building, a second truck roared into view. Another heavy, armored vehicle, packed with soldiers and gunning straight for the remaining defenders. It was a new wave, and this one could break the fragile morale of the townspeople. "Get down!" Jack shouted to Roy, who was still advancing too far. There was no time to hesitate. Jack and Roy dove for cover just as the truck revved its engines, preparing to charge. The truck didn't stop. It barreled toward them, like a freight train, and Jack could hear the unmistakable sound of machine guns mounted on its sides, spitting bullets in their direction. Tom fired his rifle, trying to hit the truck's tires, but the truck was moving too fast, and the machine guns made it nearly impossible to get a clear shot. This was a final push from the Sons of Liberty, a desperate attempt to crush whatever resistance remained. Jack's mind raced. There had to be something they could do. There had to be a way to stop them before the truck reached the last line of defense. Roy's eyes locked onto Jack's, and in that brief moment, they both knew what had to happen. They had one shot. One chance to stop the truck and turn the tide completely. "Matthews!" Jack shouted into his comms, voice urgent. "Get those explosives ready. We've got one shot at this," Roy said, his eyes narrowed with grim determination. "If it doesn't work, we're finished." "On it," Matthews responded, and Jack could hear the faint sound of him moving through the wreckage toward the detonator. The truck was now less than 100 yards away, and the gunfire was deafening. The remaining defenders scrambled to find cover, their backs against the walls, waiting for Jack to give the order. He could feel the weight of their eyes on him, the pressure mounting. They needed this. They needed him to lead them to victory. As the truck neared, Jack could feel his heart pounding in his chest. The truck was almost upon them. "Now, Matthews!" A massive explosion erupted from the middle of the street, the shockwave sending Jack flying backward. The ground trembled beneath him, and for a split second, he couldn't hear anything, only a ringing sound that filled his ears. When he managed to get his bearings, he saw the truck had been destroyed, its wreckage scattered across the road in a fiery explosion of metal and debris. The Sons of Liberty had no chance to recover. With their last major assault broken, the remaining fighters turned and fled, retreating in disarray. The battle, once hopeless, had turned into a victory. The dust settled slowly, the sounds of gunfire fading into the distant echoes. The streets were quiet now, the fighting done, but the town of Hope Springs was far from unscathed. Buildings were burning, debris littered the ground, and the stench of smoke and blood lingered in the air. People who had once been neighbors now stood together, survivors and fighters alike, staring at the remains of the battle. Jack stood amidst the destruction, breathing heavily. His body ached from the fight, his clothes covered in dirt and blood. But he couldn't afford to rest, not yet. Not while the town needed him. Roy approached, his face battered but still determined. "We did it, Jack. We actually did it." Jack nodded, his eyes scanning the streets. The people of Hope Springs were coming out of hiding now, slowly at first, but then with more confidence. They had won, against all odds. "Yeah," Jack said, his voice rough. "But this town, it's going to take a lot to rebuild." Tom joined them, giving a half-smile. "We'll rebuild it. Together." Samantha appeared from behind the gas station, her camera still in hand. Her face was streaked with soot, her eyes red from smoke, but she smiled as she approached Jack. "You did it, Jack," she said quietly. "Hope Springs is still standing because of you." Jack smiled back, but it was a weary smile, one that held the weight of the battle they just fought. "It's not just me," he said, his voice soft but filled with quiet pride. "We all did it. This town, it's ours." As the sun began to set over the smoldering remains of Hope Springs, Jack knew that the fight wasn't over. The Sons of Liberty had been driven off, but there would be more threats, more battles to face. But for now, the town had survived. They had made it through the storm, and that was enough for today. "Let's get to work," Jack said, turning to face the town's survivors. "We've got a long road ahead of us, but we'll rebuild. We'll make Hope Springs a place worth fighting for." And with that, Jack took his first steps into the uncertain future, his resolve as unshakable as ever.